Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents Critical Thinking Skills for Dummies, 2nd edition, by Martin Cohen, narrated by Stephen R. Thorne. Publisher's note: in this audio edition, you will hear references to figures and images present in the print and e-book formats of the book. Limit of liability/disclaimer of warranty. The publisher and the author make no representations or warranties with respect to the accuracy or completeness of the contents of this work, and specifically disclaim all warranties, including without limitation warranties of fitness for a particular purpose. No warranty may be created or extended by sales or promotional materials. The advice and strategies contained herein may not be suitable for every situation. This work is sold with the understanding that the publisher is not engaged in rendering legal, accounting, or other professional services. If professional assistance is required, the services of a competent professional person should be sought. Neither the publisher nor the author shall be liable for damages arising herefrom. The fact that an organization or website is referred to in this work as a citation and or a potential source of further information does not mean that the author or the publisher endorses the information the organization or website may provide or recommendations it may make. Further, readers should be aware that Internet websites listed in this work may have changed or disappeared between when this work was written and when it is read. Introduction. Critical thinking. Now that sounds like a good idea, because it's a kind of souped-up, laser-sharp, powerful thinking, just waiting to zap rotten arguments and churn out some pretty brilliant insights instead. And don't worry if people tell you that it is a rather high-level kind of thinking, and that only a few can do it, mainly tweedy professors who tell jokes in Latin. Dimidium facti qui coipit abet. He who has begun has the work half done. Because critical thinking certainly isn't like that. Critical thinking is not just for the tweedy few, but for the curious, the imaginative, the creative many. In fact, the only thing that is really deeply mysterious about critical thinking is why everyone's not doing it. I've got a theory about that, and it is to do with education and the kind of ways of working that people are corralled into, like so many sheep, supposedly as a preparation for life outside. Yet life outside is rarely just a business of unreflectively following set procedures and instructions, but rather something where you need constantly to reflect on what you are doing and why, and act not as a machine, but as a person. So the first skill a critical thinker needs to learn is how to think the unthinkable, to think outside the box, to free their mind, no less. Sounds idealistic? A bit 60s and hippies wearing flowers? Well, yes, there's a bit of idealism in critical thinking, just as there is in all the best things. But there's also a lot of structure and solid research backing it too. This book will give you what you need of both, plus plenty of opportunities to develop and test your own skills. I've done both my bit of being taught and of teaching over the years, and another rather mysterious thing is why so many people seem to imagine that thinking, let alone critical thinking, is something that can be learned by rote, that is, by writing down and memorizing a collection of facts, a body of knowledge, with right and wrong answers. Critical thinking guides that create obscure distinctions and list technical terms for you to learn are promoting passive, not active thinking. Rote learning is fine if all you ever intend to do is deal with past problems, but it won't get you many new insights or ideas. And in fact, it is the opposite of what critical thinking is all about. Critical thinking is really a set of transferable skills, learned for one thing, equally useful for another, that cuts across the whole swath of academic disciplines and is applicable in all spheres of human activity. This is why you will find critical thinking useful as part of learning design skills, nursing studies, economics, and even playing sports. It is really a toolbox for making the most of life. About this book. In this book, you can find both the conventional material on critical thinking skills, which is broadly about avoiding logical fallacies and following the rules of good essay structure, and a lot more besides. Most other books focus on these bits of critical thinking because they are easy to talk about, but rather harder to actually get anyone to do. In fact, like philosophy itself, and critical thinking is traditionally a branch of philosophy, properly understood, the only way to learn the method is to use the skills in practice. So what I offer here is a kind of map or guidebook that will come in handy as you actively start using critical thinking in whatever areas you want to. I include enough of the background to the academic debates for you to see the why as well as the what. Plenty of hands-on tips and advice so that you have the how, and I certainly include some opportunities to try things out in practical exercises. Foolish assumptions. One of the key skills in critical thinking that too often gets overlooked is knowing your audience, and indeed empathizing with them. In this case, that means understanding what motivates them. So as I write this book, just as when you write an essay or prepare a report, the crucial thing is to bear in mind the interests and needs of the likely reader. I assume that you are interested in ideas and in how to communicate them, already know there is a difference between critical thinking and just criticizing without thinking, want to be able to see through a bad argument, know how to construct a persuasive argument, although I don't make any assumptions about what you will be arguing about or the context that you are studying or working within. Whether you're young or old, male or female, an engineer or a philosopher makes no difference to me. The book is zero jargon and open access. You could be a CEO or the president, but you won't get special sections for that reason. However, I do anticipate that you might be a student, perhaps starting your studies, or perhaps having progressed to the point where you are being asked to produce longer dissertations. Because believe it or not, critical thinking is a skill in which even PhD students often fall short. This thinking gap is behind a lot of questionable research and public policy all over the world. So really, I also assume that the likely reader has a moral purpose too. You want to think better and more clearly, to get things right, not just know enough to pass the exam. On the other hand, if you are sort of a reluctant critical thinker, heck, let me have a go at converting you, because I know there is an awful lot of boring stuff out there on informal logic and structuring essays, and I certainly don't intend to add to it here. So if you are starting off by wanting just the minimum to pass, you've still come to the right place. If critical thinking is sometimes a diet of thoroughly stodgy skills, here you should find that plenty of flavoring has been added to the stew that makes it all much tastier. Icons used in this book. Technical stuff. I use this icon to point you toward more detailed explanations of important ideas or theories that shed light on critical thinking techniques and skills. Remember. I use this icon to highlight key facts and ideas that literally you may want to remember. If you know it already, sometimes it will come across more as a reminder. Tip. This flags up a simple idea that can be used to achieve both academic critical thinking aims, how to dissect an argument, for example, and also broader critical thinking skills, such as how to give space to other people to develop their ideas, rather than switch off at the first point of disagreement. Warning: I reserve this scary icon to indicate both practical pitfalls and theories that have downsides. Beyond the book. In addition to the material in the print or ebook you're reading right now, this product also comes with some Access Anywhere goodies on the web. Check out the free cheat sheet at dummies.com/cheat sheet/critical thinking for some helpful tips and hints. You can also access some fun critical thinking exercises at dummies.com/extras/critical thinking. Where to go from here? You can read this book any way you want. I don't mind if you just try a few bits that seem particularly relevant, or if you plow through the whole thing in one evening, take it to bed with you, or if you skim read it while eating chips and watching TV. In fact, I'd recommend that you don't treat it as a textbook with Lesson 1 leading to Lesson 2, because the smart reader knows, and the critical thinker is a smart reader, that information is best digested when it connects to something you have a current real need to know. Only you can say what it is at the moment you're looking at, or thinking about, or interested in. So use the index, the contents page, or that valuable method known as flicking through to find bits that seem relevant to you, and take it from there. Because I assume many readers will only dip into or out of this book, I have tried to group material into clearly labeled sections, each with its own 30-second intro, so that you can quickly check out particular aspects as and when you need to. However, if you want my advice about where to start, and why not? I wrote the book, so I ought to know a bit about it. I'd say some good places to go are: Chapter 1. This is where I welcome you to the Arguments Clinic and say a bit about what critical thinking is. Chapter 4. Assessing Your Thinking Skills contains a pretty cool test of the kind that evil employers may give you, and is quite fun, too. But don't read it for that reason, because all of the book is fun. Chapter 9. Getting to the heart of the reading matter is another possible jumping-in point. These chapters sound a bit serious, but they are also a good place to start because it's through reading that most people get new ideas and develop their views. Don't forget, that's probably why you're looking at this book in the first place. What could be better than just reading this book, then reading it while thinking critically? Part 1. Getting Started with Critical Thinking Skills. In this part, discovering how people think, understanding the sociology of thinking, assessing your thinking skills. Chapter 1. Entering the exciting world of critical thinking. In this chapter, getting the big picture on thinking skills, picking up cool tips for problem solving, steering clear of common misconceptions. Never underestimate the power of the killer fact. Often used to prove a point, facts are often what it all seems to come down to. But facts are powerless outside of an argument. What do I mean by this? I mean a logical structure, not a slanging match. And whether pronounced gently or used to close an essay, the logic of real arguments is heady stuff because, well, you can't argue with logic. However, critical thinking is about much more than being logical, as Captain Kirk used to remind Mr. Spock in episodes of the much-loved TV show Star Trek. Critical thinking is about pressing points, sniffing a bit more skeptically at issues, and generally looking more closely at everything. not only at factual claims, but also, and most importantly, at the ways in which people arrive at their views and ideas. That's why critical thinking requires not just a cool head, but also imagination, and indeed a bit of heart, an underpinning helping of emotional intelligence. You may think, why bother? Good question. I've failed plenty of job interviews in my time by being a critical thinker. Bosses, heads of department, guys in the bar, and many other folks really like people who agree with them, because for many that's the whole point of becoming the boss. At the same time, the world has no shortage of successful people who scrupulously avoid any appearance of not only thinking critically, but thinking at all. So my short answer to why be a critical thinker is that being a critical thinker is the best kind of thinker to be, even if it does sometimes mean that you're the odd one out on many issues. Critical thinkers are on mission truth, and the rewards of that go beyond essay grades and job promotions. But let's be optimistic. It can surely help there too. In this chapter, I provide an overview of critical thinking and what you can find in the rest of this book. I also cover the importance of reading between the lines and set the record straight on what critical thinking isn't. Opening the doors to the arguments clinic. You may well have been brought up not to argue. At school, you were probably encouraged to sit quietly and write down facts. I know I was. When I was 5, one teacher even used sticky tape to shut children's mouths up in class. Yes, I was one of them. Since then, I've had some very enlightened teachers who encouraged me to use my imagination, to solve some problems or do research, but still, not to argue. So welcome to a very different way of seeing the world. Critical thinking. This is truly the arguments clinic, in which punters can pay for either 5-minute or hour-long arguments, as the famous Monty Python sketch has it. No, it isn't. Yes, it is. Still say that it isn't? But yes, it is. Check out Chapter 17 now to discover 10 of the world's most influential arguments. Don't worry, I'll still be here when you get back. Of course, as the sketch says, this isn't proper argument at all, merely contradiction. Nothing like a connected series of statements intended to establish a proposition. If an ability to contradict people is all you come away with after reading this book, then you, like the man in the sketch, would be entitled to your money back. Don't worry, here you will find so many new ways of looking at issues that you'll soon be having the full hour-long arguments on everything under the sun. My aim, by the end of this section, is to give you the big picture of critical thinking. Defining critical thinking. If you look up critical thinking in a dictionary, you see that it's called the philosophical examination of arguments, and I'm a philosopher. But, at the risk of annoying the ivory tower experts straight away, I say that this kind of philosophy isn't the sort most of them do or have a clue about. Yes, as Chapter 12 shows, critical thinking does have one foot in the realm of logic, in tidily setting out arguments as premises followed by conclusions. But if that were all it was, you may as well give the job to a computer, to ChatGPT maybe. Remember, no, critical thinking is really about a range of skills and understandings, including an ability to play with words, a sensitivity to context, feelings, and emotions, and, the hardest skill to develop, the kind of open-mindedness that allows you to make creative leaps and gain insights. I know that developing these skills sounds rather like a tall order for one book to achieve. But critical thinking is also team thinking, and I draw on the ideas of many other thinkers, including a lot of input from my editors at Wiley. As a result, you don't get my opinion of critical thinking skills, but a carefully researched and lively introduction to the subject. Spotting how the brain likes to think. Professors may sniff, but I prefer to work on exercises that are fun or interesting, which is why I have tried hard to make the ones in this book like that. Here's a rather trivial little exercise, which nonetheless illustrates something important about how the human mind operates. Should you say, the yolk of the egg is white, or the yolk of the egg are white? When I first saw this question, I thought for a minute, and then I gave up and looked for the answers. That's my method with written exercises. It conserves my limited brain power for things like watching TV and eating chips at the same time. But I digress. Not good in critical thinking. This question may form the subject of a 5-minute argument, but it shouldn't stretch to an hour because neither version is correct. Egg yolks are yellow. Boom, boom. Caught you out? This exercise reveals that people's normal mode of thinking is bound within the parameters of certain rules and systems, due to thousands of years of evolution. In the jargon of psychology, human thinking uses certain heuristics, mental shortcuts for solving problems and making judgments quickly. Warning. The trouble is that automatic and well-established ways of thinking can stop you from seeing new possibilities or avoiding unexpected pitfalls. Plus, the great majority of people's thinking goes on without them being aware of it. Although sometimes quick and efficient, in certain circumstances it can rush people to the wrong conclusions. Critical thinking is your insurance policy against these questionable but more or less universal thinking habits. Evaluating what you read, hear, and think. Tip. Critical thinking is about actively questioning not only the conclusions of what you're reading or hearing, but also the assumptions, whether open or hidden, and the overall frame of reference. Critical reading is discussed in detail in Chapter 9. Critical thinkers approach an issue without preconceived assumptions, let alone prejudices, towards certain conclusions. As Professor Stella Cottrell, sometime Director for Lifelong Learning at the University of Leeds in the UK and author of a popular guide on the subject, says, critical thinkers are quite prepared to acknowledge a good argument that goes against them, and will refuse to resort to a bad argument even if it looks like the only one available to support them. Ingredients that make a critical thinker. If you're building a critical thinker, a la Dr. Frankenstein, here are the abilities and attributes you need. Tolerance. Critical thinkers delight in hearing divergent views and enjoy a real debate. Analytical skills. Critical thinkers don't accept just any form of talking. They want properly constructed arguments that present reasons and draw sound conclusions. Confidence. Critical thinkers have to be a little bit confident to be able to examine views that others present, often people in authority. Curiosity. Critical thinkers need curiosity. It may have killed the cat, but curiosity is the essential ingredient for ideas and insights. Truth-seeking. Critical thinkers are playing for team objective truth, even if it turns out to undermine their own previously held convictions and long-cherished beliefs and is flat against their self-interest. Reading between the lines. Critical thinkers know that real debates take place between the lines, and all too often under the mental radar. The job of the critical thinker is to pull the real issues into plain view, and if necessary, shoot them down. I introduce you here to some of the core skills of critical thinking: reading between the lines, examining the evidence, and quickly deconstructing texts. The chapters in Part 3 provide loads more info on how to do just that. Challenging concepts of rationality. Do you know people whose views don't seem to be based on any sort of rational assessment of the world, but rather on questionable information easily imbibed, or even on blatant prejudices? Me too. And what's more, at least some of my views, and some of your views, also fall into this rather illogical category. The fact is, even though Aristotle considered men, not women because he was emphatically prejudiced, to be rational animals in the sense of being creatures with a unique ability to reason, people rarely use their rational facility in practice. I discuss this subject in more depth in Chapter 13. More subtly, people often present good reasons for their positions, but in reality they arrive at their views for quite different ones. The good reasons are irrelevant, as you sometimes find out if you present some solid arguments that tend to disprove them. For example, suppose your neighbors buy a four-wheel drive sport utility vehicle and insist that it is vital for them to own it when the family goes off-grid. Yet the fact is that they rarely go anywhere more remote than the nearest supermarket and hate getting their shiny car dirty. Could the reason be that having a tank-sized car bolsters our sense of self-importance? Or maybe the government says that it has to charge students tuition fees. Otherwise, there won't be enough money for everyone who wants to go to college in the future. Good reason. Countries like the U.S., Britain, and Japan all now charge students with college fees. Is that freeing up a lot of money for education? No. Fees systems actually cost a lot of money to run. And in the case of the UK, they actually cost more to operate than the previous universal grants system. This is also a factor in the high health costs in the US. So, could the real reason for charging for services be more political? Practical arguments may exist for charging for things like health and education, but as I say, that's straying into politics. I'm not saying one way or the other, but I am recommending the habit of looking a little harder at the reasons and explanations people give. Dipping into the critical thinking skills toolbox. I think of critical thinking as a toolbox. Philosophers have a long tradition of seeing argument skills as tools. Read the nearby sidebar, Adding Up Aristotle's Tools, for more. Adding Up Aristotle's Tools. The most famous writings on how to argue are the 2,000-year-old books of Aristotle. His followers gathered them together and called the collection Organon, which is Greek for tool. Interestingly, this title reflects a controversy at the heart of philosophy that has never gone away. Is logic the purest form of philosophy, or merely a tool that philosophers use? So this obscure bit of ancient Greek is surprisingly political, taking sides in an educational controversy that continues to rage today. Remember, critical thinking isn't one tool, but a collection of tools. Plus, its skills can do a lot more than most of its experts seem to be aware of, because most of them come from too narrow a base. Tip: logic is a central critical thinking tool. You can see the kind of logic that it uses as a mental screwdriver with two different purposes. It enables you to take arguments completely apart and mend and reassemble them. Critical thinking also has creative uses, such as prototyping and brainstorming. See chapters 6 and 7, respectively. These hammer and nails skills, with plenty of glue added in, are great for creating new solutions and visualizing possibilities. Plus, don't forget the social and emotional components of critical thinking, which I cover in chapters 3 and 4, respectively. I like to think of these as the measuring tools in the kit, and maybe as the spirit level too. Remember, philosophical and mathematical logic is a solitary process. One person or computer can take on the world. After churning through a formal proof and finding a contradiction, the matter is closed. But critical thinking involves questioning, challenging arguments, methods, ideas, and findings, and demanding the context and the background. Therefore, it's a more sociable business where people explore and create truths collectively. Ordering your thinking: reason, analyze, and then argue. Remember. In that order, please. Non-critical thinkers may start by arguing, and then pause to analyze, and finally search for reasons. But making the argument follow the reasoning, not the other way around, is much better. Philosophers prefer to see critical thinking as a course in informal logic, the study of arguments expressed in natural language, where an argument being valid isn't enough. The conclusion has to be useful too. The chapters in Part 4 are all about that, and where I take a good look at the key skills of informal logic. For example, the fallacies that many critical thinking experts lament. But don't get too excited at the prospect of using logic to conquer the world, because, as I explain, its powers are strictly limited. Tip: the difference between a sound argument and a fallacy is often far from black and white. This isn't to imply that people don't make lots of silly mistakes and lousy arguments. Check out some logical pitfalls in Chapter 16. On the other hand, don't let any of these concerns deter you from using logic skills in your thinking, writing, check out Chapter 10, and speaking, see Chapters 11 and 14, because a little method can go a long way to making your arguments more persuasive and demonstrating the weaknesses in other people's too. Which logic for critical thinking? You can encounter plenty of types of logics: classical logic, Boolean logic, quantum logic, sentential logic, and how about a bit of multi-valued logic, or predicate logic too? Sprinkled with fuzzy logic? No. Breathe again. Critical thinking isn't a sneaky way to make students study logic. It's not even reasoning boot camp. A fundamental difference exists between all the usual logics and the one that critical thinkers include as one of their tools: informal logic. All the other logics are concerned with the form of the arguments, but only informal logic, as the name suggests, is also concerned with the content of arguments, with issues and applications. Researchers have often found that when asked, people can't really explain why they hold a particular view, or what they think would count as suitable evidence for the view. Even more worrying for society is that these same people are extremely resistant when others challenge their views. Critical thinking skills are your antidote to this very common disease. Discovering what kind of thinking you do. Building on what you already think is vital for future growth, but maybe it requires a willingness to discard old ideas and convictions too. And most of us are happier learning new things than we are when clearing out old theories. Technical stuff. 19th century American philosopher C.S. Peirce, identified 3 kinds of thinkers, which I summarize here, a little creatively, as follows. Sticklers. People who form their beliefs by tenaciously sticking to whichever view they liked most originally, whatever evidence is presented to them, and even however circumstances change. If asked to justify their view, they can be very thorough in finding facts to support it, while also refusing to look into anything that appears likely to run against it. I write about facts and opinions in Chapter 15. Followers. People who respect anyone or anything that presents itself as authoritative. They form their view in a group discussion on what they think the professor is saying, or, in the absence of an authority figure, on what they imagine is the consensus view. When they look something up on the Internet, they head for the security of Wikipedia, as they imagine it, and are reluctant to consult websites run by individuals. These kinds of thinkers, as Peirce says, are useful members of society because they aid social harmony and cohesion, although they may also be found egging on tyrants and persecuting marginalized communities. But they aren't useful as far as ideas go. System builders. These are people who try to fit everything into a pre-existing framework. They're a more sophisticated version of the sticklers. Science is obliged, in practice, to operate on a similar principle. System builders are willing to consider new information, but if it requires dismantling the pre-existing structure for understanding the world, they're likely to reject it. You can read more on how people process information to build knowledge in Chapter 8. Tip. According to Peirce, the smart way to see the world is to accept that everything you know may be wrong and start from scratch if need be, or indeed end up with all the views on an issue demolished with no working hypothesis left. Only a true critical thinker would do such a thing. Almost all professors of the arts and sciences are egregiously conceited and derive their happiness from their conceit. Erasmus. You can't always be sure that quotes really are true or just apocryphal, meaning widely circulated despite no one being really sure. Bertrand Russell, a British philosopher and logician, ascribes this quote to the 16th century Dutch humanist, and since he was himself a philosopher, prepared to argue unpopular views, such as the fact that war is a bad thing, to the extent that he was even put in prison twice, I can see why he liked it. Tip. Russell, refreshingly, took on professors and people in authority, but his point, of course, applies to everyone. Too few people are really open to new ideas, let alone able to take criticism, unless they've taken and really absorbed the lessons of critical thinking. American philosopher William James made a similar point when he complained that many people think that they're thinking when they're merely rearranging their prejudices. For critical thinkers, discerning thought and prejudice is a vital distinction to make, and the first step is becoming more aware of your biases. I examine this issue in Chapter 2. James also recommends that in many areas, people should decide their position on the basis of feelings, even if they have no good or relevant arguments to support it. How logical is that? Well, not at all, but it's not a stupid position either. We might call it emotional intelligence. In Chapter 4, I look at some distinctly non-logical ways of approaching problems. Professors tend to tell people to think and complain when they don't, but they fail to offer advice on exactly how to do it. For that, students have to rely largely on their own efforts, Or maybe turn to specialist experts, such as Maltese physician and psychologist Edward de Bono. He stresses that thinking is a skill that has to be learned. Critical thinking definitely owes pioneers of thinking skills like him a polite nod, even if the approach here has to be a little more, well, scientific. Thinking outside of the box. Here's an anecdote that shows how redefining problems can generate new insights. A gardening equipment company challenged a meeting of engineers to use their collective thinking power to come up with a new kind of lawnmower. After some humming and ahhing, the engineers came up with not very much. Some tinkering and slightly novel refinements, but nothing to create a splash in the marketplace. Then one of the engineers suggested that they return to the original problem, only this time go back one step and express it in terms of function. Instead of the engineers thinking about how to redesign lawnmowers, which meant that their thoughts followed the usual paths, he said they should think about machines to help people maintain lawns. This small, even niggly distinction made all the difference. The engineers even created an entirely new product based on the imaginative insight of one whose son liked playing with yo-yos. They invented the weed trimmer, which involves a nylon string whizzing around, thus adding a new annoyance to neighbors everywhere. The power of critical thinking. You can read more about creative brainstorming in Chapter 7. Speaking of which, here's a scientist to explain how scientists think. The mere formulation of a problem is far more often essential than its solution, which may be merely a matter of mathematical or experimental skill. To raise new questions, new possibilities, to regard old problems from a new angle, requires creative imagination and marks real advances in science. Albert Einstein, The Evolution of Physics, with L. Infeld, 1938. Well, he has to come in sooner or later. Einstein's point about creativity is absolutely spot on. Check out the nearby sidebar, Thinking Outside the Box, for an example. Understanding what critical thinking isn't. The preceding sections discuss what critical thinking is, but I now detail what it isn't. Remember, critical thinking isn't about putting arguments and debates into formal language or symbols and then spotting logical fallacies in them, despite what many books say. It is about how to look at issues and problems in the real world, with all their fuzziness and contradictions, and offer relevant, practical, and sharp insights into them. It's a skill that lets you, for example, distinguish right from wrong, choose the best business policy, and construct a compelling case for action. Tip: critical thinking is far deeper than study skills, those set ways of doing things that lecturers often teach students. Instead, it's about what to do when no obvious answers or set methods are available. Look at it this way. A study skill makes sure that you have pen and paper during lectures. Critical thinking is about what to jot down. Quantum physicist Richard Feynman said that science is grounded in the conviction that its own experts are often ignorant of what they profess to be experts about. That statement applies even more so to critical thinking. Pop over to the nearby sidebar for more of the famous physicist's advice. Warning: people who claim to be experts in critical thinking don't automatically know everything about the vast range of skills and material the subject covers or draws upon. Nonetheless, critical thinking is a skill, and so whether you're pretty hot on it or not, you can definitely improve through practice. Critical thinking isn't about learning an endless series of facts. Instead, it encourages people to develop their inbuilt thinking skills by making them active. That's why this book features lots of tricky puzzles. See Chapter 5 for more on puzzles and analogies, rather than platitudes. I want you to start thinking critically and actively from the beginning, or from the start of Chapter 2, anyway. Critical thinking is all about curiosity. Richard Feynman, the American theoretical physicist famous for his pioneering work on quantum physics, had an infectious curiosity for understanding the world. Many children lose their inborn curiosity as they grow up, but Feynman never lost his. He loved solving puzzles and riddles. He played practical jokes. He even cracked safes and broke into file cabinets. He questioned authority and didn't care what other people thought. Why? Because he was a lifelong learner. Feynman was also a great teacher who realized that you didn't truly understand something until you could clearly explain it to other people. He was naturally intelligent, but it was his personality that brought him success. In his own words, Feynman was an ordinary person who studied hard. Above all, he had the curiosity to keep learning new things, and, linked with that, the courage to follow his own path. Chapter 2. Peering into the Mind: How People Think. In this chapter, understanding how humans think, staring into the brain while it works, challenging the notion of rational scientific thinking. Some mysteries are best tackled by digging out and looking at the known facts, but not the issue of how people actually think. This one is best tackled, as philosophers have done for centuries, by asking questions. For example, when you read something, like this paragraph, whose voice do you hear in your head? Is it your own voice, or is it my voice, reappearing through the words, or is it a bit of both? This leads to the supposed conclusion that thinking is a social activity, carried on collectively, not as atomic individuals. By not atomic, I mean not as independent little building blocks. Think of a crowd cheering at a match. The individuals there seem to feel and shout as one. But this social aspect of thinking can take place outside crowds too, such as when reading. The neurologist Paul Brooks identifies a peculiar thing about this. It seems to allow other people to access and take over the language centers of your brain. To paraphrase Sidgwick, you think so because other people think so. Part of this chapter, the section Thinking Logically or Instinctively, explains how and why that may happen. Being aware of this strange phenomenon is vital when you're trying to understand both your reaction to other people's ideas and how to critically evaluate your own theories. One of the key skills, not only of critical thinking but of life in general, is the ability to reflect on your own practices. This chapter is your diagnostic manual for checking on what's going on inside your head. In debates about how people think, a gulf in philosophy has long existed between conservatives, who uphold traditional distinctions and assume the brain is a machine and therefore logical and rational, and radicals, who critique that whole approach and admire the complexity and illogicality of human thinking. This chapter takes a look at these debates, ones that shape all subject areas, including politics, so that you can move towards an effective analysis of your own and other people's reasoning. It's important to realize that even scientists aren't immune to making mistakes in this area. Thinking about how people think. Some thoughts. We think so because other people all think so, or because or because, after all, we do think so, or because we were told so and think we must think so, or because we once thought so and think we still think so, or because, having thought so, we think we will think so. Henry Sidgwick. Henry Sidgwick's contribution to understanding how people think, with which I started the chapter, touches upon the key issues, although it's hardly expressed very elegantly. If students wrote like that in exams, although they might not fail, they wouldn't get very good grades. It's almost rambling, not clear and authoritative at all. But then the English philosopher didn't exactly write those words at all. You can find plenty of people on the internet saying that he did, but when you look more closely, as critical thinkers always should do, you find that the lines are supposed to be insights that occurred to the great man in his sleep. They're things he mumbled in bed, as recorded by his relatives Arthur and Eleanor Mildred Sidgwick. Disgraceful? Yet this origin fits with his idea that thinking is not really an individual matter at all, but rather a complex social phenomenon involving lots of different associations, including misremembered and imaginary. I also examine a more specific question. To what extent do logical rules and the methods of rational argument underlie people's beliefs and the judgments and decisions they make? Or, on the contrary, are individuals more influenced by what other people think? An understanding of this tendency to groupthink provides you with a key defense against being misled by the opinions of those around you or those in authority, and also a more sophisticated way of interpreting events, debates, and decisions. Read on, but also have a think about what you think about how you think, and then perhaps try not thinking about anything. Maybe have a quiet lie down. Thinking logically or instinctively. Personally, I don't usually think of myself as having a brain like a lizard or crocodile, unless I've had a particularly bad night's sleep. But in evolutionary terms, it seems that I sure do. So if anyone wants to claim that the way that we think is what makes us human, they'd better try to work out precisely what humans do differently from animals. As I discuss in this section and throughout this chapter, the debate is as much a philosophical one as a biological one. In the first part of this section, I look at how mysterious the inner world of our thoughts still remains, even as scientists discover more and more about the external world. I first of all look at the different tasks human minds and animal minds are asked to do, and then, in Jumping to Conclusions, The Cost of Fast Thinking, I illustrate how sometimes the two kinds of thinking, human and animal, get muddled up and lead people to make rash judgments and silly mistakes. Buying beans and composing sonnets. Do monkeys think? Do plants? No, or at least not like humans, anyway. They just appear to be thinking as they follow pre-programmed evolutionary strategies, a bit like computers or contestants in a reality TV show. But unlike computers, they're undoubtedly conscious of something. For if nowadays scientists agree that the body, indeed the whole universe, is a machine, still no one is quite able to say that a ghost isn't riding along in the center of it. Celebrating the Human Mind. I wrote a book a few years ago that was an investigation of consciousness, but went under the rather more appealing title of Mind Games. Through such games, I focused on the mysteries that surround the way people think. The human mind has many inexplicable abilities. It can happily deal with imaginary things that don't really exist, that don't make sense, and that can't be explained. Imagine What a disaster it would be if a unicorn ate this book, or if it turned out your mom was an alien in disguise. Some people even think the mind can project thoughts instantaneously across distances, cause departed souls to rematerialize, and of course pass messages directly to a creator God. Yet, although mainstream philosophers and hard-nosed scientists sneer at such irrationality, that's no reason to throw out the distinction between minds and brains, between consciousness and electrical activity in nerve networks. One of the most famous philosophers of them all, René Descartes, once wrote, "I think, therefore I am." Or at least many people think he wrote that. Of course, critical readers will check such quotes very carefully and find that actually he said something a little bit different with less emphasis on the I or the lone individual. But, as I say, everyone thinks he said that, so in a sense, he did. He was suggesting that awareness of the brute fact of existing was the only thing he could be sure of, and he used this nugget not only to get himself up in the morning, but also to make sense of and rediscover the world. Technical stuff. The French philosopher was onto something big, and that thing is consciousness, that awareness we have of our own thoughts, perhaps the central mystery of philosophy. Science can explain many things, but it often just dismisses this strange sense of self-awareness as an illusion. Humans do many things that animals don't, and they do them for complex, socially defined, or aesthetical reasons. The contemporary philosopher-scientist Raymond Tallis challenges his readers to consider what's going on under the surface with something as commonplace and seemingly simple as buying a can of beans in a supermarket. Why are people buying them? It may be because they've just seen an ad for it, or because it evokes a sense of nostalgia. It might be because they think beans are cheap. Surely animals don't have to worry about things like this when they eat grass or gobble up rabbits. Yet the fact remains that many of the differences between humans and other animals are marginal. The lives of humans and chimpanzees probably looked very similar a few 100,000 years ago. No cans of beans or supermarkets then, let alone those sonnets and symphonies that philosophers love to cite as proof that humans are something special. Plus, humans didn't develop their mysterious minds in an evolutionary blink. The brain evolved over long periods of time, and so Stone Age people must have had pretty much the same kind of consciousness then. Tip. Professor Tallis is near the mark when he says that what's distinctive about humanity is its social environment, bound together by language and tool use. It's utterly different from the world within which animals exist. Artifacts, institutions, mores, laws, norms, expectations, narratives, education, training. And although humans share 98% of their genes with chimpanzees, they share precisely 0% of their chromosomes. And chromosomes are what actually do things. Jumping to conclusions. The cost of fast thinking. In this section, I look at the theory that people are basically illogical, and because of this they often get confused and make faulty judgments and silly mistakes. Understanding how people arrive at their opinions and conclusions gives insights into what people say and think, and can even help you anticipate people's behavior and responses in advance. The contemporary American psychologist Daniel Kahneman has written about the psychological basis for judgments, reactions, choices, conclusions, and much more. His writings, such as Thinking, Fast and Slow, give a significant push to the already pretty widespread view of people as, basically, irrational animals. He was even awarded a Nobel Prize for his research. Remember, Kahneman's thesis is that the human animal is systematically illogical. Not only do people misassess situations, but they do so following fairly predictable patterns. Moreover, those patterns are grounded in their ancient origins as simple animals. Survival depended on it. According to his theory, much of what we think is instinctive and hardwired. He says that people have two ways of thinking: a logical mode, which he thinks is good, of course, an earlier instinctual mode, which he says is the root of most wrong decisions. The human brain doesn't like information gaps, and so people tend to jump at the first answer/solution that looks good, rather than take the time to examine all the data, especially in a world where they receive more information every day than they have time to assimilate. Plus, the human brain loves to see patterns and make connections. Although such traits serve people well in many ways, sometimes they mislead people too. Check out the nearby sidebar, Playing Fast and Loose with Sporting Stats. For example, thinking is a complex biological process and requires a lot of energy. The human brain uses up to 20% of an adult's total energy, and for children, it gobbles up almost half their body's energy. Try multiplying two two-digit numbers in your head while running. 23 times 47, anyone? You're sure to slow down both in your running and your calculating. So, because thinking gobbles up precious mental resources, the body is programmed to avoid it. Instead, over many thousands of years, human beings have developed a range of built-in, off-the-cuff methods for reaching decisions. You might want to say that the example of the multiplication sum slowing down your running is a bit suspect. Maybe that it is the distraction rather than the mental energy that causes any slowing down. Certainly don't accept anything just because an expert says so. However, the notion of being distracted itself indicates a sort of limit in human thinking powers. That's partly why we admire people who can, say, balance on a unicycle on a tightrope while juggling. The problem with fast thinking, however, is that often it means people don't solve the right problem. They solve the easy problem. A celebrated example is the bat and ball quiz. Test yourself. A bat and a ball together cost $1.10. The bat costs $1 more than the ball. How much does the ball cost? Answer at the end of the chapter. Playing Fast and Loose with Sporting Stats. During the Women's World Cup of 2023, expert commentators and the general public alike were astonished when one of the players, Chloe Kelly, scored a penalty with a shot measured at a scorching 68.4 miles per hour. It sounds amazing, yet just how fast are shots normally? Expert soccer pundits soon offered that the shot that won the prize for the most powerful goal in the Men's Soccer Premier League the previous season struggled over the line at a paltry 66.4 miles per hour. It all began to look as if the strategy of separating men and women football leagues was really a device to provide a safe space for the men. However, the numbers, as they often do, mislead. Kelly's shot was timed with the use of a microchip in the ball that calculated its speed 500 times a second, with the highest velocity recorded just after leaving Chloe's foot. The fact that balls travel faster at the start of the shot than later on is just physics, not to say common sense. When it calculated speeds, however, the Premier League used the traditional not to say more meaningful, method of dividing the distance the ball traveled on its journey from foot to goal by the time taken. In other words, they measured the shot's average speed, and that's quite a difference. As is so often the case with statistics, the precision of the claim is misleading, and the context is crucial. Encountering illogicality with the Linda problem. The Linda problem, one of the most celebrated quizzes in psychological research, is an experiment in unintended bias. It's used to illustrate how illogical everyday judgments are ridden by fallacies anchored in evolutionary history. The original experiment, by two psychology professors, Amos Tversky and Daniel Kahneman, was elegantly simple. At the outset, participants were given this information. Linda is 31 years old, single, outspoken, and very bright. She majored in philosophy. As a student, she was deeply concerned with issues of discrimination and social justice, and also participated in anti-nuclear demonstrations. On the basis of this character sketch, the researchers asked student volunteers to rank the likelihood, probability, of Linda having one of a list of possible jobs, ranging from teacher in an elementary school to insurance salesperson, by way of works in a bookstore and takes yoga classes. They had provided a stereotype and waited to see if the research participants would be influenced by it. Technical stuff. The context seemed to be that of matching a psychological type, as per the short description, to a career choice. By implication, the research was asking the students questions like, would you be surprised to find a bright philosophy student working in a bookshop and doing yoga? Certainly for me, the answer to that is no, and the students were no different. This process, in which people use stereotypes to arrive at conclusions, has a fancy name in psychology: representativeness heuristic. That's an off-putting term, but it basically just means basing judgments on typical things. People make a lot of decisions more or less subconsciously by applying preconceived stereotypes. But because this was a psychology experiment, the researchers tucked away a sneaky trick. One of the jobs in the list, bank teller, was entered twice. The first time high up on the list, just as Linda is a bank teller, and the second time at the bottom of the list as Linda is a bank teller and is active in the feminist movement. In essence, therefore, the question being asked of the participants, and that you can ask yourself now, is this: drawing on the earlier description of Linda's character, which of these two statements do you think is more likely? Linda is a bank teller. Linda is a bank teller and is active in the feminist movement. Tversky and Kahneman wrote their description of Linda to make it seem highly likely that Linda was active in the feminist movement, but unlikely that she'd have taken a job in a bank. Thus, nearly all students considered the first option, of Linda becoming a bank teller, to be improbable. But by linking the unlikely element of the description of Linda to the likely one, the researchers found that a full 89% of students were persuaded that the description Linda is a bank teller and is active in the feminist movement was plausible, and certainly much more so than the simpler claim. Yet, here's the catch. How can Linda being a bank teller of one particular kind be more likely than her being a bank teller of all possible kinds? Oops, that's illogical. In fact, as the logicians say, the probability of a conjunction is never greater than the probability of its conjuncts. In other words, the likelihood of two particular things happening must be less than just one of them happening. Your being hit on the head by a flying pig tomorrow is very unlikely. You're being hit on the head by a flying pig tomorrow, and getting rained on is a bit less likely again, no matter how rainy it is where you live. It's kind of an iron rule, like 2 + 2 = 4. Don't argue with it. A conjunction is two or more things joined together in some sense, and a conjunct is just one or the other of the things. To make a long story short, simple logic seems to dictate that Linda being a bank teller quite simply is more likely than her being a bank teller and a feminist. But Tversky and Kahneman drew much more general conclusions than just that people don't understand formal logic. They declared that the result was solid evidence of the illogicality of human thinking. The research has been cited many times since to wag a cautionary finger at those who see human beings as rational creatures who use the lessons of experience to learn and improve their navigation of life, and to make most people look dumb instead. However, you don't have to rush to agree. This is critical thinking here. On the contrary, many possible arguments can be made as to why the second description is more likely than the first one, and why that 89% were quite entitled to say so. It all depends on the way words work, which is rather more complex than Tversky and Kahneman, let alone subsequent logicians, seem to have allowed. For more on this famous and revealing experiment, read the nearby sidebar, A Cunning Way to Argue for Intuition Against Logicians. Considering the power of group thinking. Consider for a moment why you're reading this book. Perhaps it's a project of your own devising to become more logical. Or, on the contrary, perhaps this book is part of a kind of groupthink, brainwashing even, an effort by society to make you think a certain way. Outlandish idea, perhaps, but that's one possible implication Professor Deanna Kuhn draws from her research into psychology and education. She is concerned that as a society, people spend much of their time and effort determining what they believe, but seem to care little about how they come to believe what they do. A Cunning Way to Argue for Intuition Against Logicians. Critical thinkers always need to ask why. In the Linda problem described in the nearby section, the mathematical model of the probabilities is so at odds with human intuition. We might feel we really ought to follow the math and ditch our intuitions. However, consider this. Another way of modeling the problem is to argue that when one of the categories includes two pieces of information, by implication, all the categories do too. On a menu, if it's stated that the roast turkey comes with cranberry sauce, by implication the other dishes don't. In this case, by adding, and is a feminist to the description of Linda as a bank teller. The researchers also added a rider to each of the other descriptions. It might be the implication that she is not a feminist. At the very least, it would be something like, and there is no information about whether or not she is a feminist. In that sense, as far as these jobs go, her status as feminist or not isn't known. It's undetermined. When no information is available for an undetermined value like this, the conventional way is to make it being true or false equally likely. That is, to compute it with the value of 0.5. That's how mathematicians calculate the odds of something that in everyday language is said to be even, or 50-50. With real life being full of uncertainties, and many possible career paths being available, Linda's job is very hard to predict. And so all the options must have a very low probability, even her being an elementary school teacher. On the other hand, her being a feminist is almost certain. The description makes it so. If the math is treated this way, then just as almost all the students insisted, Linda being a feminist bank teller really is more likely than her being a bank teller who may or may not be a feminist. This way of recalculating the options brings the logic into line with intuition, which is how such things should be done, rather than vice versa. But what do you think? Questioning your beliefs. The question about the extent that people are in control of their decisions and the extent to which they simply follow other people is important to Deanna Kuhn. She believes that critical thinkers should see thinking as a form of argument because individuals' beliefs are chosen from among alternatives on the basis of the evidence for them. However, her research caused her increasingly to question the extent to which individuals actually do hold their beliefs on the basis of evidence, instead of as a result of social pressures. Warning: Deanna Kuhn's rather alarming conclusion is that many people don't or can't give adequate evidence for the beliefs they hold. And, even worse, people are unwilling or unable to consider revising their beliefs when presented with evidence against them. Kuhn holds that reasoned argument requires, at the very least, this ability to distinguish between the theoretical framework and the physical evidence. Cascading information. Technical stuff. Cascade theory is the idea that information cascades down the side of an informational pyramid, like a waterfall. If people don't have the ability or the interest to discover something for themselves, they find that adopting the views of others is easier. This act is, without doubt, a useful social instinct, and an individual relying on information passed on by others is often quite rational. After all, thinking is difficult and energy-sapping, as I explain in the earlier section, Jumping to Conclusions, the Cost of Fast Thinking. Warning: Unfortunately, following wrong information is less rational, and that's often what happens. People cascade uselessly in everyday ways, like so many wildebeest fleeing a non-existent lion. A lot of economic activity and business behavior, including management fads, the adoption of new technologies and innovations, not to mention the vexed issues of health and safety regulation, reflect exactly this tendency of the herd to follow poor information. There are two possible but conflicting strategies for coping with the tendency of people to unthinkingly absorb and follow false information. Some people suggest that society needs to encourage a range of views to be heard, even when they're annoying to the majority. For instance, allowing people to deny global warming, or to let teachers decide what they're going to teach. Other people say that society needs stricter control of information to stop the spread of wrong views. This view is the one currently cascading down the pyramid. For a great example of cascade theory, check out the nearby sidebar, "Don't snack on chips while reading this." Don't snack on chips while reading this. One of the best examples of information cascade is the entirely false consensus around the danger of so-called fatty foods, despite it having no medical or scientific basis. This theory is credited to a single researcher, Ansel Keys, who published a paper saying that Americans were suffering from an epidemic of heart disease because their diet was fattier than their bodies were accustomed to after thousands of years of natural evolution. In the ensuing years, results from 4 other countries appeared to confirm that a high-fat diet coincided with high rates of heart disease. Unfortunately for this theory, prehistoric traditional diets turn out not to be especially low-fat, after all, and in the most relevant period of 100 years before the supposed epidemic of heart disease, Americans had actually been consuming large amounts of fatty meat, and so the epidemic followed a reduction in the amount of fat consumed, not an increase. The problem is that the human brain is quite good at seeing things the way it wants to see them, also known as subjectivity, rather than the way they really are, aka objectivity. It can even see patterns in raw data that don't exist. For example, Keyes simply excluded the many countries that didn't fit his theory, like France and Italy, with their oily but healthy cuisine, and the obvious factor for higher rates of heart disease that people were now living long enough to develop heart disease, rather than being killed off by things like other diseases. But the cascade had started. Soon, despite the protests of specialist researchers about the lack of good evidence, hardly any doctors were prepared to speak out against such an overwhelming consensus. In fact, in recent years, large-scale studies in which comparable groups have been put on controlled diets, low-fat and high-fat, appear to show that the low-fat diet seems to be unhealthy, but no one is quite sure why. So the next time someone says that all the experts agree, even if they're philosophers, Nobel Prize winners, or even TV personalities, don't be so sure that that proves anything at all. Watching how the brain thinks. Wouldn't you love to be able to see a great brain, such as Einstein's, Copernicus's, or Robbie Williams's, thinking? To watch as the neurons spark into action and they solve another mystery of the universe, like how are space and time related? Maybe the Earth goes around the sun. Or why don't I have hit records anymore? It's important for critical thinkers to know whether they really can think freely or are only churning through data, more or less efficiently, in the manner of a very complicated computer. In this section, I look at some of the arguments for thinking that the human mind is actually more complicated than that, and by implication is capable of achieving more things. My nerves are playing up. The brain at work. Francis Crick, the 20th century British biochemist who played a key role in the discovery of DNA, imagined he'd solved the mystery of how human beings think. He chalked it up to nerve cells and molecules. Many academics take what seems a small step from this conclusion to assuming, as Canadian psychologist Steven Pinker puts it, that the mind is a system of organs of computation designed by natural selection to solve the problems faced by our evolutionary ancestors. Can scientists really read thoughts in the brain? Neuroscience, the science of the brain, is all about new technology. Raymond Tallis is a medical man, and he points out rather revealingly that fMRI brain scanners aren't infallible and can be rather imprecise. They certainly can't pinpoint particular thoughts placed in minds by social scientists. Forget all those color pictures in magazines of people's brains working as they are shown pictures of loved ones, or maybe fast food. Tallis accuses the experiments with brain scanners of being laughingly crude and mind-numbingly simplistic. For example, even the best scanners operate by measuring blood flow, which varies over timescales of seconds. But the real activity of the brain, the electrical changes in the busy neurons, is measured in milliseconds. In experiments in which subjects may be shown photographs of friends on the one hand and lovers on the other, researchers may take the difference in the brain scans to indicate an amazing unconditional love spot. Yet, when more mundane experiments are done with subjects being asked to, for example, tap their fingers, researchers can deduce nothing from the brain scans about finger tapping. So, What are the chances of discovering anything about grand emotional reactions? Neuroscience is very good at showing things like light getting into the brain through the eyes and triggering nerve impulses. However, the gaze looking out remains another matter entirely. After all, as Tallis says, it is a person that looks out, not a brain. Even neurophysiologists allow that the seen object that people construct isn't really there, but is created by the brain. But this is paradoxical. The brain is shaping the world that it's shaped by? Philosophers in particular should remember that the world is an undifferentiated mass until the mind splits it up into discrete parts. Warning. Raymond Tallis, a British philosopher, however, is appalled by this Darwinization of our understanding of humanity, as well as by neuromania more generally, which he defines as a far-reaching use of what's offered as the latest brain science to supposedly reveal how the human mind works. The stakes are high, too, he warns, muttering about the awful lessons of history when societies adopted policies based on pseudoscience and applied them with great cruelty against millions of individuals. I say more about this in Chapter 3. Technical stuff. Neuromaniacs see the mind as being nothing more or less than the human brain, and the brain itself as a machine. They even assume the presence of a central controller, a little person inside the big person, something akin to the program that runs in a digital computer. But perhaps the brain and the mind aren't the same thing. Raymond Tallis refreshingly puts the contrary argument that in fact human thinking is incredibly, unbelievably complicated. At a biological level, the brain reacts in unpredictable, even chaotic ways, and is being constantly altered by individual experiences. Remember, the consequence of this alternative view for critical thinking is that issues are seen as being open and multidimensional, rather than settled and black and white. Truth is seen as coming in shades of gray from various sources, rather than being delivered once and for all by an expert. Stereotypes versus statistics. Guess who wins? The psychologist Daniel Kahneman makes the point that all people have a tendency to let stereotypes trump statistics. For example, if 2 people on your street were robbed last year, your assessment of the level of crime is probably too high, whatever the official claims are about such things. Newspaper headlines provide a similar kind of distorting perspective on the world. If your paper runs a series on women attacked at night walking home, while my paper runs a series on why walking is good for the health, we end up with 2 quite different views on the same matter, based on a partial and misleading kind of evidence, what we've read in the paper. The power of the mass media to distort, if not quite all human thinking, certainly people's assessments of risk, is shown in public anxiety over things such as children being attacked by strangers on the way to buy candy, or train stations being blown up in terrorist attacks. But that's partly to do with the statistical nature of risk assessment. Humans just don't get stats. Try this problem out. Here's the data. A census classifies 85% of men in a city as Lithuanian and 15% as Estonian. A witness to a street robbery identifies the assailant as Estonian. The court tests the reliability of the witness, and he's able to correctly identify people as being either Lithuanian or Estonian 80% of the time, but he mistakes people's origins up to 20% of the time. Without being prejudiced one way or the other, of course, but having limited resources, in which community should the police prioritize its search for the robber? Once you've thought about this, check my answer at the end of the chapter. Getting inside scientists' heads. I realized that this heading may produce for some people a scary image of miniaturized Raquel Welch and Donald Pleasance a la Fantastic Voyage being injected into a scientist's ear. That movie's quite old, but it's worth checking out. So you'll be glad to know that this section is actually about getting a handle on the kind of material that you need to analyze and evaluate in many areas of life. Critical thinking requires you not only to handle information effectively, but to put it into a wider context, and even, when necessary, to treat it skeptically. The conventional view of science is of a steady progression from crude guesses to sophisticated knowledge, propelled by ever more ingenious techniques and machinery. Like a majestic river, science heads only in one direction, and if foolish humans attempt to erect barriers to its progress, at some point their obstructions are swept aside, and the great wave of discovery flows on. I take a look at this traditional approach, which involves conjecture and refutation, and also at a view that challenges it: paradigm shifts. Uncritical thinkers just want to take whatever is said or written by a scientist as the plain facts of the matter. But more sophisticated thinkers recognize that across the whole sweep of human knowledge, facts keep changing. A textbook that was a pretty good guide 30 years ago is likely to be substantially flawed by today's standards. This section explains why. Engaging with scientific convention. Much of the history of Western philosophy assumes a steady, comforting process. Knowledge exists and just needs to be identified rationally. When firm foundations have been established, the rest of the edifice can be constructed without needing to worry about one or another bit of it later being shown to be wrong. Warning: but this picture ignores the complexities and inconsistencies of real life. Whatever people may like to think in science, experiments don't lead to new theories, because all historically significant theories, and quite a few insignificant ones too, agree with the facts. And as every politician and spin doctor knows, lots of facts exist, and if you want to, you can choose them to bolster your theory. Scientists are no different, but they think they are. Trusting conjecture and refutation. Conventionally speaking, people suppose that when experiments are conducted to test theories in reality, and the results don't accord with those anticipated, the theory is disproven. But some philosophers, called critical rationalists, reject this view, that thinking coolly and logically about the world is the route to true knowledge. Thinkers, such as Karl Popper, argue that no theory-free, infallible observations exist, but instead that all observation is theory-laden and involves seeing the world through the distorting glass and filter of a pre-existing conceptual scheme. Popper writes, "If we are uncritical, we shall always find what we want. We shall look for and find confirmations, and we shall look away from and not see whatever might be dangerous to our pet theories. In this way, it is only too easy to obtain what appears to be overwhelming evidence in favor of a theory which, if approached critically, would have been refuted." Remember, yet, in a way, the 18th century philosopher David Hume was even more radical than Popper. He concluded that science and philosophy alike rested less upon the rock of logic and human reason, but rather upon the shifting sands of scientific fashion and aesthetic preferences. Hume's approach is exactly that of the critical thinker, taking nothing as given, but insisting on the full application of reason in all areas, ignoring and standing free from conventional opinion. Certainly, this made him unpopular in many circles, but it also gave him some great insights into many issues. Thinking in fits and starts. Paradigm shifts. None of us can function without a set of assumptions. You can't make sense of this book unless you assume that I use words the same way that you do, or that the book is read from front to back, rather than, say, from the previous section, backwards. And it would seem pretty silly to start any other way, unless you live in China. Scientists start off by making a whole load of assumptions when they try to do anything too. They have to do this. But many of these background assumptions are just guesses, and many of them get abandoned later. Worst of all, starting assumptions tend to block off other alternatives and can stymie progress. Technical stuff. Although a somewhat woolly term these days, a paradigm is a kind of picture or way of picturing something. In its simplest form, the theory of paradigm shifts claims that scientific knowledge proceeds in fits and starts, with theories fighting to the death, as it were, against each other, instead of as a smooth process of the accumulation and refinement that people like to imagine. Instead of being logical or rational, scientists find that the old theory has become too complicated and cumbersome to modify, and so they collectively abandon it. Or else a split emerges between followers of one theory and another, which is eventually decided in favor of the new theory for any number of reasons, none of them particularly scientific. This abandonment of a long-standing way of seeing an issue towards a new way is the paradigm shift. When Copernicus first cautiously suggested that perhaps a better way to understand the workings of the universe was to suppose that the Earth and the rest of the planets went around the sun in elegant circles, with occasional digressions for little circles within the big circles, rather than the Earth staying put and everything, including the stars, rotating around it, the math went against him. The fact was, the movements of the moon, the sun, and the planets could be better calculated and predicted using the old system, even if it was quite complicated. The church authorities insisted that the facts, the mathematics, should decide the issue. But a few scientific radicals, like the famous astronomer and physicist Galileo, preferred the simplicity and elegance of Copernicus's new theory and campaigned in public for its acceptance. Which side would you support? The traditional view of the universe, well supported by the facts and figures, or a trendy new one that clearly needed a lot more work before it could be considered even a competitor? Answers to Chapter 2's exercises. Here are the answers to this chapter's exercises. Pricing bats and balls. Fast, instinctive thinking jumps out with an answer. 10 cents. Alas, the answer is wrong. Check the math. The bat cost $1 more than the ball, which means that the ball must be a real bargain at just 5 cents. Bat equals $1.05. Ball equals 5 cents, to a total of $1.10. Slow thinking, as well as distrusting your intuition, is required to come up with the right answer. Looking for the robber. Given the numbers in the scenario, most people assume that the smart place to start looking for the attacker in the incident is among the Estonian community, because of the witness testimony, even though a possibility clearly exists that the witness may have made a misidentification. Yet pause a moment and suppose that 10,000 Lithuanian people live in the city and just one Estonian. Given the witness evidence, it seems like a slam dunk for the police, doesn't it? But then remember that the witness sees Estonian people 20% of the time. The strategy isn't so clear-cut now because the witness will often say someone is Estonian when they aren't. In fact, the mathematically correct answer, even to the original scenario, is that a higher probability exists that the villain involved in the street robbery was Lithuanian rather than Estonian. So the police should be looking for a Lithuanian robber. Mathematicians use a technique called Bayesian analysis to get an exact figure. But the important thing is to be aware of the general issue. The reliability of the identification of the robber as Estonian is, in this case, 41%, only about half the 80% reliability people comfortably opted for without thinking it through. Astronomical wrangles. You can be forgiven if you think this is a bit of a no-brainer. Of course, the Earth goes around the Sun, and so you support the newfangled theory, even if pesky observations went against it, not least because the planets actually orbit the Sun in ellipses, not wiggly circles. But when you do that, you have to accept that you are throwing out any pretense that you think scientific matters should be settled on the basis of the facts and figures and evidence. This is what the radical philosopher Paul Feyerabend meant when he argued in his books that in science, the only rule is that there are no rules. And what's more, that it is only by breaking rules that scientists have been able to make the progress for which they are, albeit maybe only much later on, praised. Chapter 3. Planting Ideas in Your Head. The Sociology of Thinking. In this chapter, shaping views through social forces, controlling people through propaganda, using emotions to persuade, recognizing the language of persuasion. Most people offering their views on something think that they're presenting just the facts, helping others to avoid errors and see the light, so to speak. But plenty of others, such as experts in public relations, PR, marketing, and political campaigning, see facts as just the raw materials for a bigger project, planting new ideas in the public mind. Now, of course, some ideas are good and socially beneficial. For example, that we need to keep rivers unpolluted and help sick children get the necessary treatment. And many others are harmless. But certain ideas are dangerous and lead to injustice and suffering. Unfortunately, history indicates fairly convincingly that the nastiest ideas seem to be the easiest to plant. They spread like fungus, while the more delicate blooms of human culture wilt and fade. That is, if they're not actually strangled. As a critical thinker, you need to know how to spot these pernicious ideas so that you can investigate and challenge them. In this chapter, on the social dimensions and consequences of how people think and argue, I invite you to jump into my time machine, return to the first half of the 20th century, and consider the sociological insights of one Mr. Adolf Hitler, and how the Nazis used propaganda to win mass support. Everyone knows Hitler was a crazy, really bad guy, but fewer people realize that he pioneered the sophisticated control of information and ideas to support a political program. He worked it all out in detail. In fact, he wrote a book about it, which should have warned people early on to stop his quest for power. But lesson 1 about politics is that warnings are thrown about like confetti, and it's usually only when it is far too late that voters put on their critical thinking hats. You may not be surprised to see that I include that master manipulator here, but I wonder about your reaction on discovering that even in the freedom-loving West, censorship and control of the news in the public interest is never far away. Therefore, as well as discussing how politicians and advertisers influence you, I also look at how in the UK, the BBC, as funded public service broadcasting, a bit like PBS in the United States, tries, and sometimes fails, to be balanced, and why critical thinking skills are vital to the well-being of society. Asking whether you're thinking what you think you're thinking. Many people say that even if they don't know much about many things, at least they know what they like. But no, sorry, sucker, hard luck. What they like, indeed, what anyone likes, is often not their decision or choice at all. On the contrary, what people like is one of the things most susceptible to outside influence. This section is about how social forces shape people's views, for example, in the economic and marketing spheres. Knowing how outside forces work on people. Remember, outside forces can mold not only, say, people's musical or cinematic tastes or their political opinions, but also all those practical consumer choices that define people, something that marketing experts know very well. When you answer questions like the following ones, you aren't really dealing with practical matters at all. Rather, you are responding to other people and trying to project a particular image of yourself. What kind of car do you think you need? Does it really need seats for 6 children and a cattle pusher affixed to the front bumper? What kind of restaurants would you eat at? They all do food, but in some cases you would probably rather starve first than go there. What's driving that? And clothes. Most people, yes, even me, wear the same sort of things all the time, almost a uniform. So when Auntie buys me a workout suit with a loud checkerboard design, I can't imagine wearing it. Nope, I'm a fashion victim. But so are you, and our ideas about the kind of shoes, socks, and shirts we think are smart or cool to wear are not quite as free as we usually imagine. Which is why a forgotten photo of me from a few years back shows me wearing exactly one of those ghastly checkerboard jumpsuits. How could my tastes have been so bad then? For more on advertising, see later sections, Consumer Demand, and Manipulating Minds and Persuading People. Influencing people's opinions. If you think I'm exaggerating about the power of social forces in this context, reflect for a moment on how your own views and tastes keep changing. Maybe you used to have a favorite pair of yellow corduroys, enjoyed watching Terminator films, and ate lots of popcorn. Now, you think corduroy is really unfashionable, and you say popcorn is so last century, just like the films it used to go with. Tip. Far from tastes and opinions being things that people carefully arrive at after due consideration, they seem to be more like fashionable, or not, clothes that people change regularly. Sometimes people change entire preference sets almost overnight, particularly if their circumstances change. For example, when they go from being a radical student studying international economics to landing a lucrative job as a trader in a bank. One journalist I know went from being the features editor on a right-wing tabloid newspaper to being deputy editor on a hard-left magazine. Within a few weeks, this person's trademark trouser suit and coiffured hairstyle became jean jackets and a crew cut. Circumstances alter values, even for the most independently minded person. Consumer demand. Technical stuff. According to J.K. Galbraith, the great 20th century economist, consumer demand, the sum of all the decisions everyone takes about the things they feel that they can't get by without, such as lunch, cars, or smartphones, has very little to do with a person's individual needs and everything to do with everyone else's behavior and opinions. Or, to be more precise, with a small group of powerful influencers' opinions. Nowadays, the term influencer has taken on a whole new meaning with the rise of social media, with models and celebrities surreptitiously promoting places and products. According to the website influencemarketinghub.com, the most influential influencer of them all is the footballer Cristiano Ronaldo, whose posts online are valued at $3,234,000. He's promoted brands like Nike for sports gear, Herbalife for health supplements, and even an anti-dandruff shampoo. But what sort of people did Galbraith have in mind as influencers? Well, not so much individuals at all, but corporations. They try to mold consumer behavior in various ways, so that people want to buy whatever it is they want to sell. In his book, The Affluent Society, 1958, he argues that in modern affluent societies, consumer demand is largely driven by the influence of advertising and marketing, rather than by genuine human needs. He says that the production and marketing of goods and services creates artificial desires and wants. Take cell phones. You maybe can't imagine doing without them now, but not that long ago they didn't even exist. Less successful, though, have been products like smartwatches, which people find hard to use and also can't quite be persuaded they actually need. No, influence is more subtle than just, for example, Richard Branson proclaiming that polo neck jumpers are cool and millions of people immediately ordering one. Influence doesn't work like that, even though companies do pay celebrities quite big sums nowadays to endorse their products on the Internet. As Galbraith explains, what really influences people is much more difficult to be aware of, but involves two key social forces: emulation and advertising. These forces shape all our views, even when we write essays on quite different topics, so a critical thinker needs to always be aware of them. Emulation. Technical stuff. Emulation is the first key social force Galbraith identifies. It is the desire to keep ahead of the neighbors, or, to be more precise, to keep up with the peer group. This desire is so universal that it seems only normal to be like that, and frankly, antisocial not to be. Teenagers are obvious examples. They have to have those brand new sneakers, iPhones, and the latest electronic devices, not to mention the Che Guevara posters. Okay, maybe not the posters, though Grandpa may still want one. But adults are no better. They have to have the family cars with Bluetooth connectivity and the 5-minute Italian ravioli meals in the low-energy freezer compartment ready for when they get home. Even critical thinkers have their hidden weaknesses, for things like watching documentaries, and for old bicycles and dried fruit. But maybe I'm wrong about the typical critical thinker. After all, I'm not a marketing expert. Nonetheless, if you buy a book on critical thinking skills on the Internet these days, a computer algorithm will soon link you to other products you may be interested in, and put ads for them under your nose to tempt you. What kinds of things have been popping up recently on web pages to tempt you? Warning. Galbraith explains consumer choices by saying that demand for a product and the desire of a company that produces goods or services for a market are locked in a feedback cycle. As production increases, so too does need for the product, or something like it. Hence, the developed world's problem with people overeating, why electronic devices demand ever larger chunks of people's time, and why even closets never have enough room for everyone's shoes or coats. Advertising. The second key force Galbraith identifies is advertising. This is at its most effective when it talks about things that you already have some sense that you may want, when it persuades you to buy this brand rather than any other. Technical stuff. But in terms of economics, its significance is its role in creating new wants, new desires. In advertising circles, this is called the dependence effect, all about the subtle ways in which advertising companies convince people that they need things that they don't really need. The well-known researcher on persuasion, Dr. Robert Cialdini, sometime professor of psychology and marketing at Arizona State University, has described 7 techniques for ethical persuasion in a book called Influence: The Psychology of Persuasion. The 7 push factors that he thinks make people say yes are scarcity, authority, social proof, sympathy, reciprocity, consistency, and unity. And of them all, it is scarcity that is the most cunning. Companies use bogus time limits and special offers relentlessly to push us into purchases. I talk much more about how advertising works in the later section, Manipulating Minds and Persuading People. Thinking and Indoctrination. Propaganda. This section is all about the 3 P's: prejudice, propaganda, and public relations, PR for short. The gold standard for critical thinking is usually said to be balance, depth of understanding, and accuracy, and certainly the 3 P's sit uncomfortably with that. Even so, of course, the issues are not black and white. Publicity for a good cause we salute. And when is a strong conviction a prejudice, and when is it a courageously held view? Remember, originally the word propaganda meant to propagate or plant ideas, and was quite a positive notion. Teachers plant ideas in children's minds, for example. The hate propaganda of the Nazis changed all that, though, and in the 21st century, nearly all governments eschew propaganda and instead pay lip service to the values of a free and independent voice for teachers, the press, TV, and other forms of media. Even so, they make sure that education and the media, especially the news media, are firmly under government supervision, which can quickly become control. Here's what you think, comrade: Russia and China. In Russia, the brief flowering of differing viewpoints that President Gorbachev encouraged in the 1980s, called glasnost, or opening up, was soon replaced by ruthless suppression of independent voices in favor of a centralized system. Snooping on snapshots and selfies. In 2021, Apple hastily rode back a planned upgrade to its phones that would have involved the company checking that there weren't any photos on them that there shouldn't be. The company mentioned child pornography as an example, which of course alarmed all those parents with pictures of their little ones playing in the bath. The scanning would have been automated, with the phones of suspicious users being disabled and a report sent to a third party. The announcement caused a furor, with tech privacy and security organizations pointing out that the technology could all too easily be extended to fit the political agenda of authoritarian governments. In China, for example, Mr. Hu might check the phones for pictures of Winnie the Pooh. Why Winnie? Because the lovable bear had become a subversive political symbol there. As I say, Apple dropped this upgrade, but that doesn't mean snooping isn't going on. Today, the Department of Homeland Security, the FBI, and the State Department are among many U.S. federal agencies that routinely monitor social platforms to identify threats of violence or terrorism, and the exact circumstances under which they are permitted to do so are not publicly given. In fact, back in 2014, the London Guardian revealed that the British and American governments were already routinely reading people's emails and checking photos that teenagers swapped on phones. In response to the story, the British Secret Service visited the paper and insisted on destroying the hard disks of the computers from which it had been drawn. To underline that this was all in the public interest, of course, the spooks, spies, offered some scary advice to the journalists about how bad people could listen to the conversations by focusing lasers on their coffee cups. What do cups of coffee say to one another, I wonder? These days, this revolves around the official Russian state news agency, led, at the time of writing, by Dmitry Kiselov, a former talk show host notorious for his charming suggestion that the hearts of gay people should be incinerated in ovens. Under such centralized government guidance, the Russian media majors in one subject: praise of the Russian president. No wonder the current post holder, Vladimir Putin, has achieved ever higher popularity ratings at home, while busy waging wars to protect ethnic Russians and creating laws, such as one against homosexual propaganda, which opponents say has caused an upturn in homophobic violence and threats. Not a new idea, of course. Hitler also increased his popularity when he targeted gays, making them wear a special pink triangle. Later on, many homosexuals died in the concentration camps. Tip: countries such as China stress a different kind of news management. Printed stories are carefully checked to be safe and suitable for public consumption, and thousands of people are paid to monitor Internet chat sites and discussion boards for signs of undesirable political comments. The government pays teams of watchers to note the names and IP addresses, electronic details that identify the geographical location of computer users, of anyone posting dangerous views or misinformation, and many an anonymous, that's what they thought, surfer later receives a sinister knock at the door. Mr. Hitler appealing to the man on the street. If you want to know about how governments can manipulate their citizens' minds, you have to know about Hitler. Hitler and his henchman, Joseph Goebbels, made propaganda into a science, and since they were very proud of what they were doing, they left critical thinkers lots of insider information on just how it all works. Both knowledge and analysis of Hitler's techniques are invaluable for critical thinkers for spotting similar things that go on today. Nazis may seem a bit like ancient history, but unfortunately the propaganda tools they used are still just as powerful and dangerous. So we need to understand how they worked. Adolf Hitler was originally a not very good watercolor artist and later a very disgruntled, demobilized soldier. However, he then discovered he had a dangerous gift for propaganda and mass suggestion. In his autobiography, Mein Kampf, 1923, which translates as My Struggle, he writes, "The art of propaganda lies in understanding the emotional ideas of the great masses and finding, through a psychologically correct form, the way to the attention and thence to the heart of the broad masses. The receptivity of the great masses is very limited. Their intelligence is small, but their power of forgetting is enormous. In consequence of these facts, all effective propaganda must be limited to a very few points, and must harp on these in slogans until the last member of the public understands what you want him to understand by your slogan." For more on how Hitler manipulated with emotion and what he thought of the public, check out the later sections Appealing to Feelings, The Psychology of Argument, and Manipulating Minds and Persuading People, respectively. Tip: Mein Kampf is surprisingly readable. It opens with an engaging, even amusing account of Hitler's arrival in Vienna from the provinces at age 15. This technique is used to create the image of a personable, charming future dictator, the image that so impressed some Western statesmen. It also connects to the style of personal narrative that modern-day politicians often substitute for discussion of political ideologies, the aim being to win over voters by appealing to their emotions rather than their intellects. See Figure 3-1, which can be found in the print and e-book versions of this book. Curiously, in a 1990 article for Vanity Fair, Ivana Trump, Donald Trump's first wife, reportedly told her attorney that Trump kept a book of Hitler's speeches by the bedside. That book is thought to be Mein Kampf, but if it was, Trump denied ever reading it. Suspicious? But to be fair, we've all got books on tables we've never got around to looking at. You may have read about the almost hypnotic effect Hitler had on his audiences, and of his extraordinary skills as a speaker. But I think the truth is rather more prosaic than that. Look at one of the old clips showing him speak, if you don't believe me. Instead, Hitler based his political messages on a shrewd and realistic assessment of popular opinion and the views of the man on the street. Today, there are so-called populist leaders in many countries, including Russia, India, Turkey, Hungary, and the Philippines. Populism is a political approach that seeks to tap into resentments among ordinary people who feel that their concerns are disregarded by established elite groups. Some people would count former President Trump in the list, too, with his border wall and America First rhetoric. Looking back, it is hard to see why Hitler's crude, hate-filled messages found such fertile ground. But propaganda doesn't need to be clever or subtle, and in a few years under Hitler's marketing, the Nazis went from being a handful of disaffected ex-soldiers meeting in a pub every week to a mass movement of millions, able to take control of one of the world's most intellectually sophisticated and highly developed nations. Remember, it's true that the death camps came only at the end of Hitler's period in government, yet the Nazi doctrine, which always and unambiguously anticipated them, was initially embraced by many in the Western democracies as a fine thing. See nearby sidebar, What the Papers Said About Nazism. What the Papers Said About Nazism. Hitler says he learned the black arts of propaganda from the English. He credits the British War Office for showing him to limit messages to a few points, devised specifically for mass consumption, and repeated with indefatigable persistence. The London newspapers admired him. When Adolf Hitler became Chancellor in January 1933, the British newspaper magnate Lord Rothermere produced a series of articles acclaiming the new regime. The Daily Mail criticized the old women of both sexes who filled British newspapers with rabid reports of Nazi excesses. Instead, the newspaper claimed, Hitler had saved Germany from Israelites of international attachments, and the minor misdeeds of individual Nazis will be submerged by the immense benefits that the new regime is already bestowing upon Germany. Before war eventually changed its minds, the British government wasn't unduly concerned that in Mein Kampf, Hitler suggested killing ethnic minorities, Reds, and disabled people. In fact, the Daily Express enthusiastically covered the visit of the former British Prime Minister Lloyd George to see the newly declared German Führer and uncritically reported his comments. "I have now seen the famous German leader, and also something of the great change he has effected. Whatever one may think of his methods, and they are certainly not those of a parliamentary country, there can be no doubt that he has achieved a marvelous transformation in the spirit of the people, in their attitude towards each other, and in their social and economic outlook." Extract from the report published in the Daily Express, London, September 17, 1936. The moral is, don't believe everything you read in the newspapers or on social media or even see on YouTube. Appreciating the difficulties of staying impartial. The earlier section, asking whether you're thinking what you think you're thinking, shows that many apparently free choices have been subjected to outside influences. A natural conclusion to draw from this social power is how difficult people can find being neutral, that is, to avoid taking sides on any issue. Influential social media sites like Facebook and Instagram, owned by Meta, and Twitter, now called X, have been accused of being biased both in how they police their sites and in how they promote content that they do not like. Posts are suspected of being suppressed or alternatively pushed at users, accusations that spread because the algorithms the sites use are kept secret. Attempts by social media to police their users' posts have been more controversial still. In 2020, after protesters, outraged by the death of George Floyd, a black man, torched a police station, President Trump tweeted that the protesters were thugs and warned, "When the looting starts, the shooting starts." The president's tweet was flagged by Twitter as glorifying violence, but left visible in the public interest. That was Twitter's idea of balance, I guess. However, in this section, I tell the story of how the British Broadcasting Corporation, BBC, threw out its charter, which as a funded public service, like PBS in the United States, stipulates balance and impartiality, and turned reporting about climate issues into propaganda for a particular cause. It campaigned against human burning of fossil fuels, such as oil and coal. Of course, most people nowadays would say this was a virtuous campaign, but that's not the point. We want news, like critical thinking, to be based on facts and arguments, not warm wishes and received opinions. Tip: as you read this section, think about the way public opinion is influenced by the media, within which the BBC is just one important player, who in turn are influenced by their perception of public opinion. Being neutral, up to a point. The BBC. All BBC staff carry an identity card proclaiming the BBC's first mission, just like a critical thinker, is to be independent, impartial, and honest. Yet, as a 2007 BBC report, gnomically entitled From Seesaw to Wagon Wheel, more helpfully subtitled Safeguarding Impartiality in the 21st Century, acknowledges, impartiality is easier to talk about than to achieve. As the BBC report stated, recent history is littered with instances of mainstream opinion moving away from the expert consensus. Examples include the change of monetarism, the theory that controlling the supply of money is the key to stabilizing the economy, from being advocated by a few right-wing economists to a central feature of every European government's economic policy. Or the spread of nationalist resentment against the European Union, or the drop in support for multiculturalism. What's a neutral BBC reporter to do when covering such subjects? Things are heating up. The climate change debate. The BBC report notes that climate change is a particular subject where dissenters can be unpopular. There may be now a broad scientific consensus that climate change is definitely happening, and that it is at least predominantly man-made. But the second part of that consensus still has some intelligent and articulate opponents, even if a small minority. In fact, using the term climate change is a prejudicial way to frame the debate, because everyone agrees that climate changes all the time. In fact, the subject is man-made global warming, specifically the government's view that it's happening and is caused by overconsumption of fossil fuels, such as coal. The debate about how to approach many issues concerning the human impact on the environment has often been vexed and highly politicized. The issue has a huge impact on everyone, not only because of things like increased storms or higher temperatures, but because of all the new taxes on energy, the changes in the way energy is being generated, and in the way food is grown. This last having huge implications for some of the world's poorest countries. The BBC's report says that its policy on the issue should be that dissenters' voices can still be heard, because the BBC's role isn't to close down this debate. Impartiality always requires a breadth of view, and bias by elimination is as dangerous today as it ever was. It even adds that the BBC has many public purposes, but joining campaigns to save the planet isn't one of them. Instead, program makers should reflect the full range of debate that such topics offer, scientifically, politically, and ethically. However, reports and practice don't necessarily go in the same direction, and in Britain, as in the United States and many other countries, skeptical voices are no longer tolerated. Isn't stifling debate dangerous, though? You betcha, which is why the very first amendment of the U.S. Constitution protects freedom of speech. Struggling to find a consensus. Climate change believers and deniers constitute significantly different proportions of the major political parties in the United States. When U.S.-based researchers from the Public Religion Research Institute tested opinion in 2014, they found that nearly two-thirds of Democrats were firm believers, along with another 20% who were sympathizers. By 2022, nearly 8 out of 10 Democrats were calling climate change a major threat to the country. Yet the figure was reversed among Republicans. What does it mean to be balanced when there are basically two opposed camps using different facts? Tip: rather than try to reflect the range of views on climate change, the BBC tried to settle on just one, a so-called consensus view. But finding the consensus view is by no means easy. Just think, how would you obtain a balanced view on some controversial or complicated matter, let alone a highly political one? The BBC's effort to find a climate consensus started off with the holding of a high-level seminar in Exeter, in southwest England, where, to be honest, it rarely gets very hot, with some of the best scientific experts. After this, it came to the view that the weight of evidence no longer justifies equal space being given to the opponents of the consensus. Thus, whereas previously news reports and documentaries may have said that many scientists believe that burning coal and oil is causing the ice caps to disappear, cue pictures of drowning polar bears in the Daily Mail, and even the towering Himalayas to melt, now the BBC simply stated such things as fact. Researching the experts' views sounds like a good way to approach many matters. But a critical thinker has to look skeptically at this sort of appeal to authority. In this case, when you do look closer, you find a little bit of spin seems to have been added to the message. For a start, the BBC report doesn't mention that the seminar was partly funded by the UK government and organized in conjunction with a lobby group called the International Broadcasting Trust, both of which were fully signed up as climate change campaigners with policy aims of increasing coverage about perceived human environmental damage. Likewise, skeptics might wonder about choosing Exeter to hold the conference. It is a nice town, but it's an awfully long way from Broadcasting House in London. Why meet there? Could it be because the town is the HQ of the UK government's research unit, whose job is to produce evidence of the effects of human-made global warming? That's some of the background, setup, the funding, and the organizing in question. But more importantly, who were the invited experts? Critical thinkers always want to check the source for the claim. No source, no credibility. But now here's an odd thing. When people asked this, the BBC went to court to prevent the information from ever becoming public, to keep their sources secret. And the court granted the request. Unfortunately for the BBC, an Italian climate skeptic later found all the names of the people at the expert conference on a long-forgotten website. The BBC, like someone deleting an embarrassing post on Facebook, fell victim to the way information is copied around and swirls endlessly on the World Wide Web. The list showed that far from a representative sample of scientific opinion, the meeting consisted of scientists whose jobs revolved around proving the theory of human-made climate change, plenty of campaigners whose commitment to the cause of fighting global warming was in inverse proportion to their expert knowledge, as well as oil companies with financial interests, such as British Petroleum. Oil companies, despite what you may have read many times, are one of the big winners of the coal is bad for you policy because they own most of the world's gas reserves and very few coal mines. Given the selection of experts to give evidence, the meeting was almost certain to come to only one conclusion. Consensus was obtained at the expense of genuine debate. Critical thinkers don't do that sort of stuff. Appealing to feelings. The psychology of argument. Do you think what you think, you think? Not likely. And nor do any of us. It turns out instead that we mostly think what we feel. In this section, I look first at how propagandists use emotional responses to bypass the reasoning part of the brain, for good or evil, or just to sell detergent. Foregrounding this technique is a crucial first step for critical thinkers in getting back to rational argumentation, which is where the marks, if not the votes, are. In the later section, Grabbing the Attention of the Gullible, I explain how one reason for Hitler's popularity was that he understood his audience, or to be more precise, that he recognized the different elements of it. Unfortunately, his comments about the public mind then are as true today as ever, and thus are essential for anyone seeking to persuade others of a certain point of view to bear in mind. Using emotions to powerful effect. One of Hitler's all-too influential ideas is that slogans are a much better way to influence mass opinion than arguments, and debate is always best avoided. That's right. What you are studying in this book, which is all about the importance of real debates and well-founded arguments, has almost nothing to do with influencing people. In the book 1984, the radical British author George Orwell offers some powerful examples of an imaginary totalitarian regime controlling the population with slogans like "War is peace," "Freedom is slavery," and "Ignorance is strength." Recent American political slogans include "Stop the Steal," used by Republicans as a shorthand for the theory, discredited in numerous court hearings, that widespread electoral fraud occurred during the 2020 presidential election, with the aim of denying Donald Trump victory over Joe Biden. Another slogan employed by Trump is "Make America Great Again," short enough to fit on a baseball cap. This slogan, actually coined by former President Ronald Reagan in the 1980s, is sort of meaningless, but conveys the idea that someone, notably the other political party, is working to do the opposite. Anyway, it is revealing, for analysts of political language, to find that instead of facts, much of Mein Kampf comprises pages upon irrelevant pages of Hitler's early years, views on clothing, nonsense descriptions of the appearance of Jews, and so on. This is because Mein Kampf is a new kind of political philosophy. It's not a work of rational argument, but of irrational or emotive appeals. Psychologists know that we tend to respond at an irrational level, and then explain our reactions with what we think are suitable reasons later. Remember, Mein Kampf was the first of a new kind of political manifesto that used the kinds of methods and pulled the kinds of levers that marketing experts use, rather than plodding through formal arguments backed by boring old evidence. The reality that voters are persuaded less by arguments than by feelings is illustrated by Jutta Rüdiger in her account of her thoughts after she heard Adolf Hitler speak in Dusseldorf in 1932. I must say it was an electrifying atmosphere. Even before 1933, everybody was waiting for him, as if he was a savior. Then he went to the podium. I remember it all went quiet, and he started to speak in his serious voice, calm, slow, and then he got more and more enthusiastic. I must admit I can't remember exactly what he actually said, but my impression afterwards was, this is a man who does not want anything for himself, but only thinks about how he can help the German people. Grabbing the attention of the gullible. Hitler writes that the politician, and equally campaigners, journalists, and advertisers, seeking to influence opinion, should aim to attract attention, and should definitely not be in the business of trying to educate people. The initial bid for attention should be aimed at the emotions and only to a very limited degree at the so-called intellect. After all, as he says with great cynicism, all propaganda must be popular, and its intellectual level must be adjusted to the most limited intelligence among those it is addressed to. Consequently, the greater the mass it is intended to reach, the lower its purely intellectual level will have to be. There are echoes here of recent U.S. politics and the Trump playbook. Consider what the Southern Poverty Law Center has written about Stephen Miller, one of Trump's political advisors. Stephen Miller is credited with shaping the racist and draconian immigration policies of President Trump, which include the zero-tolerance policy, also known as family separation, the Muslim ban, and ending the Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals, DACA, program. These are strategies aiming to play on fears and prejudices, and in particular the fear of foreigners taking over America. And just as in Europe in the 1930s, the political message was aimed at an uneducated or poorly educated audience. That's a tactic again straight out of Hitler's playbook. Hitler, now truly into his role of a pioneer spin doctor, analyzes in some detail the audience for propaganda, which he divides into three groups. Maybe check out C.S. Pierce's Categories of Thinkers, too, in Chapter 1. those who believe everything they read. Naturally, this group of the gullible is the largest, which has social and, you may say, practical advantages. It's also obviously at the heart of most of the tragedies of human history. As a reader of this book, you don't fit in this category. Those who have ceased to believe anything. This group is smaller, composed of people who previously belonged to the gullible, but who've been upset by events and have shifted to the opposite extreme where they no longer believe anything and instead suspect everything. Hitler writes, "They hate every newspaper. Either they don't read it at all, or without exception fly into a rage over the contents, since in their opinion they consist only of lies and falsehoods. These people are very hard to handle, since they are suspicious even in the face of the truth. Consequently, they are lost for all positive political work." This is the group that Donald Trump again addresses when he talks of fake news. Are you a total denier, or do you belong instead in this last group? Those who examine critically what they read and judge accordingly. In other words, a subtle, critical thinker. Here's what Hitler has to say about these people. Most of them, in the course of their lives, have learned to regard every journalist as a rascal on principle, who tells the truth only once in a blue moon. Unfortunately, however, the importance of these splendid people lies only in their intelligence and not in their number. A misfortune at a time when wisdom is nothing and the majority is everything. Today, when the ballot of the masses decides, the chief weight lies with the most numerous group, and this is the first, the mob of the simple or credulous. The critical thinkers group is always bound to be the smallest in Hitler's assessment. It consists of the minds with real mental subtlety, whom natural gifts and education have taught to think independently, who try to form their own judgment on all things, and who subject everything they read to a thorough examination and further development of their own. They will not look at a newspaper without always collaborating in their minds, and the writer has no easy time of it. The masses are gullible and easily led, and so, speaking at the time as a political outsider, Hitler says that through education and control of the press, the state has to prevent these people from falling into the hands of bad, ignorant, or even vicious educators. Well, he'd know. Spotting prejudice dressed as science. I say quite a lot about how propaganda avoids formal arguments and tries to go behind the scenes, as it were, to appeal to the emotions. But many campaigns do use at least the appearance of factual, maybe even scientific claims to compel people to accept their conclusions. In this section, you can find out about one of the most influential bad arguments in history, and one of the nastiest, and have a go at trying to counter it. Nazism is a philosophy with only one plank: prejudice. It was successful because prejudice against other races or religions, or against old people, or young people, or sick people, whatever it is, however outrageous, however irrational, is never deeply buried in the human psyche. Hitler launched his early tirades, as he would his later wars, against all sorts of imagined categories of inferior humans, such as the Slavs, blacks, and even his later allies, the Japanese and Italians. Hitler explains that significance of his theories on pure blood to the German public with a crude pastiche of Darwin's evolutionary theory. Any crossing of two beings not at exactly the same level produces a medium between the level of the two parents. This means the offspring will probably stand higher than the racially lower parent, but not as high as the higher one. Consequently, it will later succumb in the struggle against the higher level. Such mating is contrary to the will of nature for the higher breeding of all life. The precondition for this does not lie in associating superior and inferior, but the total victory over the former. The stronger must dominate and not blend with the weaker, thus sacrificing his own greatness. How would you push back against this argument? It's not a new view. That much-respected historical figure Plato used a very similar line in one of his books. Nor is it a view that disappeared with Hitler after the war, but instead it has been used in a different form, for example, in the U.S. against Native Americans, and in European countries against disabled people. Remember, the tragic fact is that the Nazi political platform did attract mass support, including among women. Although the Nazis' official platform insisted that women should have no say in matters outside the organization of household life and the bringing up of children, Hitler himself noted that women's votes got him into power, though plenty of men helped too. Manipulating minds and persuading people. In this section, I plunge into current thinking in marketing and consumer advertising, and show how the persuaders can be split into three main varieties, each with their own particular technique. The section, Recognizing the Language of Persuasion, takes this a bit further. It explains how psychological factors, such as the technique known as emotional transfer, can be used to make sure you don't actually think what you think you think. The final section, Spotting the Techniques Being Used on You, contains some really useful techniques that you may like to try to spot. But first, another nasty but true lesson from Hitler about persuasion. Ever wondered why politicians are so dogmatic and just repeat one point all the time? Hitler was sure he knew the answer. As soon as you sacrifice this slogan and try to be many-sided, the effect will piddle away, for the crowd can neither digest nor retain the material offered. In this way, the result is weakened and, in the end, entirely canceled out. Hitler saw the general public as being so slow to pick up on ideas that speakers had to repeat and repeat them. He also realized that the best propaganda appears not to be political at all. He advocates the cleansing of culture in all fields, from theater to the press, so that everything served to perpetuate only healthy ideas. And he, of course, decided what was healthy. Looking back on Nazi Germany after the war, Hannah Arendt, a German Jew who fled the Nazi regime, tried to pick it apart for future thinkers to prevent it from happening again. In The Origins of Totalitarianism, she writes of the propaganda technique of seeding cynicism. Paradoxically, the demagogue encourages people to disbelieve everything as a way of insinuating into their heads their own ideas. As Arendt writes in the preface to The Origins of Totalitarianism, 1951, in an ever-changing, incomprehensible world, the masses had reached the point where they would, at the same time, believe everything and nothing, think that everything was possible and nothing was true. The totalitarian mass leaders based their propaganda on the correct psychological assumption that under such conditions, one could make people believe the most fantastic statements one day and trust that if the next day they were given irrefutable proof of their falsehood, they would take refuge in cynicism. Instead of deserting the leaders who had lied to them, they would protest that they had known all along that the statement was a lie and would admire the leaders for their superior tactical cleverness. Understanding how persuasion in society works. The goal of most media messages is to persuade the audience to believe or do something. Hollywood movies use expensive special effects to make viewers believe that what they're seeing is real. TV and newspapers use images, which may not be quite what they appear, as well as several techniques, such as carefully selected short quotations from identified sources, to make readers believe that the story is accurate. Every time one word is used instead of another, and every small twist of grammar, subtly affects the way you interpret and receive information and messages. Language defines and shapes the world, and language is far from neutral. The experts in the language of persuasion are the people who work in advertising, public relations, and campaigning. Advertisers. The most straightforward group. They seek to persuade people to buy a product or service. They usually present their message in plain sight, as an advertisement, making it much easier to keep a certain critical distance from the message. Public relations. These experts sell positive images, maybe of a political organization or of a commercial brand on behalf of a corporation, government, or other organization, and they like to do this selling covertly. A certain brand of computer may be used by the hero in a film, or an ambitious politician appears in a TV documentary talking about their love of nature. Campaigning or advocacy groups. They also want people to buy into particular beliefs or policies, and although they use upfront and straightforward advertisements for their views, they also try to skew debates in their favor, so that by the time representatives are actually interviewed on the show or in the press, their views have already been presented to the reader or viewer as facts. Remember, the one constant between all these groups is that they all use the language of persuasion, often called rhetoric. They want to make change happen through rhetoric, through the power of words. Recognizing the language of persuasion. Tip. The trick with the language of persuasion in advertising or campaigning more generally is to link a product or idea with something else that the audience is known already to like or desire, something full of positive associations. A breakfast cereal is linked to a beautiful young woman walking through a field of flowers, for example. On the other hand, political and advocacy campaigns often link to things the audience is known to dislike or fear. Think about how many times you've seen the following images used. To sell protectionist policies on trade. Unappealing images of immigrants, or scary images of shuttered factories and sad-looking citizens waiting in line for food handouts. To sell the idea that taxes on energy should rise. Official reports warning that the Amazon is drying out, that many coastal cities will disappear under the waves and tropical diseases will invade your hometown. To sell organic alternatives. Health food companies have used tales of children dying from pesticides. Recoiling in horror as millions of Americans see Daisy get blown up by a bomb. Perhaps the most famous political ad of all time ran on air, just the once, during the 1964 presidential election. On the Democratic side, Lyndon Johnson had taken over from John F. Kennedy as president and commander-in-chief after the latter's assassination. Additionally, the party was split over civil rights legislation, among other issues. But when the Republicans nominated conservative Senator Barry Goldwater, with his hardline anti-Soviet rhetoric and language of extremism in the defense of liberty, it gave Johnson's campaign an opening. They filmed a cute little girl picking the petals off a daisy, one by one, while counting down. However, when she reached the final petal, the shot changed to a stark image of an atomic bomb exploding. Viewers were shocked and scared. Some even thought the little girl had actually been blown up. This severe and blunt ad helped Johnson easily win the general election in November. Remember, these horror scenarios are irrelevant to most people's lives today. But the persuaders know that messages are more powerful when they're stated indirectly, when association is implied. Psychologists refer to the process as emotional transfer. I include several of the most common persuasion techniques in the next section. Spotting the techniques being used on you. Here are some sneaky techniques that you may well be exposed to every day. Keep an eye open and see who's trying to persuade you of their views using these kinds of methods. Think of this list as beautiful people being warm and fuzzy. Everyone else is doing it. The so-called bandwagon effect. People do like to follow the crowd. Which book is best? See the one that's selling most. Which restaurant has the best food? This one has the most clients in it. So when an advertisement shows a lot of fun-looking, happy people doing something, everyone wants to be part of it too. Politicians use the same technique when they claim to speak for everyday people and, of course, hard-working families. Be like your hero. The views of the beautiful, famous, and successful, and role models of various kinds are much more interesting than just anyone's views, and campaigners of all stripes know this. The exception, of course, is when the message is about everyone thinks such and such, when a celebrity is a less suitable advocate and dull Mr. and Mrs. Brown seem very convincing. Naturally, in an ad, Mr. and Mrs. Brown are actually actors, not plain at all. Trust me. In the late 1990s, the American talk show diva Oprah Winfrey inspired thousands of people to read when she began a TV book club segment on her talk show. It became so popular that it was even credited with reviving the book industry. A key part of the appeal was that Oprah presented herself as a modest and simple person who had found that books helped her to see and understand the world and herself. Her 13 million viewers felt she could be trusted, and she had an unparalleled influence on America's buying power, called the O factor. Unfortunately, some stories are too good to be true. One recommendation, Herman Rosenblatt's memoir, Angel at the Fence, embraced by Winfrey as the single greatest love story, turned out to be phony. The author admitted he fabricated the whole story of how he and his wife met at a Nazi concentration camp. So much for Oprah's golden touch. Trust me. People often want an expert view. How many boxes of detergent have been sold because the actor recommending it put on a white coat and black-rimmed glasses? Just as in a hospital, uniforms reassure, and the appearance of being part of an expert group is all that matters. Many areas of current public controversy, such as are fossil fuels causing the plant to overheat, or can alternative health techniques ever work, are regularly supposed to be settled merely by producing evidence of a large majority of experts on one side of the issue. Don't forget, sometimes plain folks can also be experts, as when a dog owner endorses a brand of dog food. Weasel words. Remarkably little can be said if you know how to slip in the odd weasel word. Lawyers, politicians, and scientists all have great skill in using these. Unproven, exaggerated, and outrageous claims can be made, as long as they're accompanied by words such as may, can, could, some, or many. Watch for those giveaway words that render the claim in the passage more or less meaningless. And weaselly sentence structure has got many a politician off the hook. Flattery. That nice method of polishing egos. People selling you something are the nicest people in town. They admire your taste and judgment. You know a good thing when you see one. You demand quality. You deserve the best of the best. Warm and fuzzy. Looking at images of families on vacation or kids playing with pets can be relied on to produce those warm and fuzzy feelings in the viewer, especially if aided by great music, pleasant voices, and maybe some visual special effects, too. Cue pink sunset over ocean. Chapter 4. Assessing Your Thinking Skills. In this chapter, trying out your critical thinking skills, steering clear of thinking errors, appreciating the value of emotional and creative intelligences. English mathematician and physicist Sir Isaac Newton was a pretty clever chap, but a key part of his cleverness was being open-minded and curious and thinking in unconventional ways. These are the hallmarks and the key skills of the critical thinker. And the good news? Everyone can develop them. So if you read only one chapter in the book, make it this one. It offers an overview of all the aspects of thinking that people often overlook. For too long, courses supposed to help you think have plodded through various kinds of rules and exercises that use only a tiny, narrow kind of thinking. In this chapter, I explain why these days informal logic is moving away from its focus on dissecting arguments that seem valid but aren't, towards a view of truth and the appropriate use of arguments that puts a much greater emphasis on the context. The skills needed turn out to be much more social than mathematical. After all, if arguments are restricted to those involving clear propositions, most of the issues people encounter in real life, or most of the mass messages they're bombarded with every day, aren't arguments at all. Traditional critical thinking too often focuses on what's in an argument, and neglects to look at what's been left outside, whether inadvertently or deliberately. This chapter helps you avoid that pitfall. Discovering your personal thinking habits. This section concerns the theory that because humans are animals that live in groups, their minds have a tendency to think sociocentrically, that is, to think like everyone around them. First of all, this section tips you off about what's too often wrong with education and why it fails to give people any real training in critical thinking. Then, you get a chance to find out how you measure up to the ideal, with my own specially crafted thinking test. Don't worry, it's quite fun, and definitely an eye-opener. Identifying the essence of critical thinking. It's true that no one seems to have heard of him nowadays, but let me give you a taste of the views of the man who, in many ways, started the whole critical thinking ball rolling about a century ago, and whose ideas continue to influence the way the subject is taught now. Well over 100 years ago, in 1906, William Graham Sumner published a groundbreaking study of how people think called Folkways, which blended elements of sociology and anthropology. Sumner is not particularly well known, but he was a remarkable man, a true polymath, expert at everything, with a keen interest in public affairs. Despite the title, the message of his study is anything but whimsical. He says that people's thinking skills are systematically drained out of them in schools, colleges, and the workplace. Sound plausible? The trouble is that modern education is rooted in assumptions about the need to turn individuals into citizens ready to play a role in society. As he puts it, Schools make persons all on one pattern, orthodoxy. School education, unless it is regulated by the best knowledge and good sense, will produce men and women who are all of one pattern, as if turned in a lathe. An orthodoxy is produced in regard to all of the great doctrines of life. It consists of the most worn and commonplace opinions which are common in the masses. The popular opinions always contain broad fallacies, half-truths, and glib generalizations. William Graham Sumner, Folkways, 1906. Everyone is like this. Fortunately, you're now aware of it. According to Sumner, the solution, or antidote, is a hefty dose of critical thinking skills in life and in education. Remember, the critical faculty is a product of education and training. It is a mental habit and power. It is a prime condition of human welfare that men and women should be trained in it. It is our only guarantee against delusion, deception, superstition, and misapprehension of ourselves and our earthly circumstances. William Graham Sumner, Folkways, 1906. For Sumner, education should be about an insistence on what he calls accuracy and a rational control of all processes and methods, coupled with a habit of demanding logical arguments to back up all claims, along with an indefatigable willingness to rethink and, if necessary, to go back and start again. Remember, the true critical thinker waits for solid evidence, weighs claims coolly, and resists appeals to prejudices. Such people, Sumner says, make the best citizens. Testing your own critical thinking skills. To discover how you measure up to Sumner's ideal, try out the test in this section. After all, tests and critical thinking skills seem to go hand in hand. Tip: I looked at lots of these tests in order to prepare this one, but I should straightaway confide to you that I think most of the standard tests are nonsense. No kidding, I really do. The questions conventionally used to measure critical thinking skills range widely across a lot of areas: verbal skills, visual skills, and of course number skills. But I doubt whether they measure anything that deserves to be called critical thinking. More important than that, plenty of research indicates that such tests are poor indicators of how anyone may do in any real-world job or situation. The tests only seem to show how good you are at doing, well, tests. Try this. Nonetheless, lots of people do think such skills are terribly relevant and important, and they certainly tell you something, even if it's only how well you do in a critical thinking skills paper. Naturally, a true critical thinker will always try new things and be quite happy to tackle tests like this, both in the spirit of fun and to discover something about their own thinking patterns and preferences. So, here's one to try. The time allowed for the 10 questions is 30 minutes. You can find the answers at the end of this chapter, but don't cheat. Question 1. Brain teaser. A famous architect builds a hexagonal holiday house in such a way that windows on each side point south to catch the sun. The first day that the new owners are in the house, they're amazed to see through the windows a large, furry animal slowly walk right round the house. 2 skill-stretching queries are, what color is the beast? And how do you know? A. It's brown because most large furry animals are brown. B. It's black because bears are black. C. It's white because of the specifications for the windows of the house. D. There's no possible way to answer this, and if this is critical thinking, it's stupid. Question 2. Word pictures. Take a look at the pictures in this section of the print and e-book versions of this book. Each picture is made up of words, but also represents a common saying. Can you see what the everyday adage is? A. Sec und decision. B. Another one. C. Are up ums. D. Downward. Question 3. Spot the fallacy. In the following example, try to pin down the precise problem with the argument. For more on types of argument errors, check out Chapter 16. Many vegetarians believe that killing animals is wrong, just as killing people is. If they could have their way, anyone who eats meat would go to prison. A. Slippery slope. B. Begging the question or circular argument. C. Straw man. D. Non sequitur. E. Ad hominem. Tip. Don't worry if you haven't a clue what these are about. It's just jargon. But that's one thing a lot of these tests measure. Skip to the answers now if you want a quick decoding of the language in this question. Now, try to pin down the precise problem with this argument. You can check up on the definitions for the argument types in the answers, as well as find out in more detail about some more in Chapter 16. Tea and coffee both contain caffeine, which is a drug. Excess caffeine intake has dangerous side effects, potentially including heart attacks. Therefore, drinking tea or coffee is dangerous. A. Slippery slope. B. Begging the question or circular argument. C. Straw man. D. Non sequitur. E. Ad hominem. Question 4. Good argument. I think rich people ought to pay lots of taxes in order to help those who are not so rich. Which of the following responses to my statement provides the strongest argument? A. Martin, you are absolutely right. Why, it's plain immoral for them not to do so. B. No, Martin. Instead of forcibly taxing the rich, which of course makes them mean with their money, we should have low taxes and encourage them to give to charity. Most of the rich people I know are actually very generous. C. Absolutely. It is essential, in order for a society to function properly, that we lift as many people as possible out of poverty and enable them to contribute to the economy. D. The fact is that life isn't fair. There's no point trying to make the world fit some fanciful idea you have of it. We have to accept the way things are and just get on with living. Question 5. Typecasting. Which one of the following scenarios best describes a situation in which emotion, rather than logic or rational thought, has been allowed to decide the outcome? A. Mary hates looking at herself in the mirror. She thinks she is overweight, so she decides to take up jogging. B. Someone has just telephoned the school to say that they've planted a bomb in one of the buildings. Even though nothing like it has ever happened before, the principal orders all the students and staff out of the buildings and tells everyone to go home. C. Mark has a job interview at a Silicon Valley computer firm and wants to look the part at his interview. He buys some computer magazines to look at the pictures of the kind of people who seem to work in high-tech businesses and tries to pick clothes to make himself fit that style. D. Jenny wants to buy a new car, but the model she likes best out of the ones that she can afford has high carbon emissions. She worries that this may be the kind of buying decision that if lots of people took would contribute to climate change and be bad for the planet. She wants to be the change she believes in, so she gets a different car that's less suitable for her needs but has a better environmental footprint. E. The publisher is amazed at the new sales figures for critical thinking books, which are much higher than anyone had predicted. It decides in future to take very little notice of anything the marketing folk in the firm say. What do intelligence tests really measure? The intelligence test taken by most students in the U.S., known as the Standardized Assessment Test, SAT, is an extraordinarily accurate indicator of how wealthy students' families are. If you started families all living on between $0 and $20,000, which is considered very low income, the average SAT score of college-bound students is 1,326 out of a possible 2,400. Jump to the $20,000 to $40,000 bracket, and the scores go up to a whisker over 1,400. In the next bracket, the scores edge up, and the same again all the way in jumps of $20,000 to the families with more than $200,000 income a year. The students coming from these rich families typically score just over 1,700 points. You can interpret these figures in several ways, of course. One, which suits the rich people, is to suppose that rich kids are smarter than poor kids. Perhaps people suggest that the parents are richer because they're smarter, and their skills have simply been passed on. A second explanation may be to say that the richer you are, the better the education you get. Better schools, extra tutors, and so on. And so your scores go up for that reason. You may have been informally educated, too. Maybe you were given books as a kid and taken on outings that widened your horizons. Despite originally being designed to treat everyone taking it equally, the SAT is recognized as being very much influenced by the amount of training students have had in taking the test. As with conventional exams, the success of students depends to some extent on their teachers' skills. The third way of looking at this issue is to say that the test isn't measuring intelligence or problem-solving so much as social class. Social class would tend to follow incomes. But wouldn't it be a disgrace to filter access to the best colleges by measuring which social class students come from? Such a thing would be really rather scandalous, yet that's unmistakably the lesson of this research. A very similar kind of thing can be said for using conventional exams, such as the UK's A-levels, as a way of deciding who should go to colleges, too. Question 6. More typecasting. Jenny designs wallpaper for a home decor business. She's good at her job, but is disconcerted when a new and enthusiastic man joins the company and asks her for ideas for a marketing campaign for the wallpapers. Marketing and advertising aren't her area of expertise at all. Should she, A, find out what other wallpaper manufacturers are doing to market their designs, and arrange to chat with people in the marketing department to get their views and share a few ideas? Brainstorm it, too, maybe. B. Email the new man in marketing, copy to the CEO, colleagues, that she's the wrong person for this task because she is a designer and knows nothing about marketing. Suggest that if he can't think of anything himself, he should look around for someone with the right skills. C. Politely acknowledge the request for info and promise to deal with it as a priority. Then make sure she's not available until long after the decisions have all been taken anyway by someone else. After all, they'll probably be better qualified to handle it anyway. Question 7. Business skills. You're stressed about the mountain of work piling up and realize that you can't possibly finish it all. What's the smart way to meet the challenge? A. Do the best you can, working evenings and weekends and skipping meals if necessary to get it all done in some form or another. B. Send a note to everyone involved stating clearly that your workload is excessive and you can only do a proper job if some of the deadlines are extended and less new work is set. C. Recognize that it is your feelings that are the key factor. You feel tired and stressed. Reduce your working hours, take more time off, have proper meals, and maybe go somewhere nice over the weekend, too. Question 8. Time management. In your job, you always seem to have several tasks to complete by the end of the week. What's the most efficient way of organizing your time? A. Be linear. Take the jobs one thing at a time, not starting a new task until you finish with the one at hand. B. Multitask. Tackle everything at once, because this keeps you from getting bored and some areas overlap, thus immediately saving time. C. Recognize that the problem isn't your way of working, but the amount of time you have. Take a strict look at your daily timetable and clear out all the unnecessary jobs and commit yourself to putting in extra hours until the backlog is cleared. Question 9. Justice for TV watchers. Have a look at this argument. In Britain, every household pays the same amount for their televisions, regardless of how many TVs they have or how much they watch them. Surely, this is unfair. Instead, TV should be made a subscription service that tracks viewing so that those who watch the most pay the most. This wouldn't only be fairer, but could also bring in more revenue. Which of the following arguments uses the same principle as the previous one? Hint: the question isn't about whether or not the argument is a good one, but rather about its structure. A. Things should only be available free to people if they can't afford them otherwise. B. Discounts on bus and train fares should be available to people who travel most. C. Rich people should pay a surcharge on their houses to help poor people who don't have a home at all. D. Television channels should be funded by general taxation so that the richer you are, the more you pay. E. Internet sites that make a lot of money from advertising shouldn't be able to charge for access. Question 10. Car rentals. Take a deep breath. Here's the math question. Budget Rental Cars rents out cars at a cost of $19.99 per day, plus free mileage for the first 100 miles. An extra charge of $1 applies for every mile traveled over 100 miles. Luxury Limos charges $100 per day just for taking the car out of their showrooms, and 20 cents for every single mile traveled. How many miles would you need to travel before it paid for you to hire a luxury limo? A. 101. B. 131. C. 151. D. 171. E. It's always cheaper to hire budget. Bonus question. The riddle of the old-fashioned brew. Hint: this is another math question and is based on a question for one of the big critical thinking testing organizations. The Munchkins family makes tea following the traditional rule. Warm the pot and add 1 spoonful of tea per person, plus 1 for the pot. The family used to buy a packet of Green Lion tea every week, but because Grandma came to live with them, their tea buying has gone up. Now, every 5th week, they buy an extra packet of tea. Your question is, how many people were at home before Grandma arrived? Busting myths about thinking. You know how your mind sort of glazes over when asked to list all the major exports of Bulgaria, or to calculate how long a swimming pool will take to fill if a tap drips at the rate of 2.5 centimeters cubed every minute? But there are people who can do such things, and you've probably gotten used to the idea that they're the head of the class. In this section, I describe some misconceptions that people have about thinking, rationality, and logicality, and put in a word for some very different ways of seeing intelligence. Accepting that sloppy thinking can work. Here, I want to take a scientific look at unscientific thinking, splitting it into two main types, and pick out when it has to be avoided and when maybe it should be allowed a little more space. Technical stuff. Psychologists distinguish between two kinds of errors that people make when reasoning: motivational or hot illusions. These stem from the influence of emotions and assessments of personal interests upon the reasoning. For example, most people assume that their current views will stay the same for the foreseeable future and fiercely defend them, even though in reality most people's views change and evolve all the time. Cognitive or cold illusions. These stem from errors in your reasoning. Things like mixing up correlation and causation. Because yes, two things may keep happening together, like you're planning for a picnic and it raining, but that doesn't actually mean one caused the other. Or having an unconscious bias in favor of information that fits with your existing views. Many researchers consider that because both kinds of errors are so common, indeed almost universal, they must have some kind of evolutionary purpose, indeed advantage, for the human species. Remember, what most people would call sloppy reasoning allows for quick responses and so may increase the chance of survival in situations where a lack of time or of background information can be fatal. Plenty of research also suggests that people who distort assessments in favor of their own self-interest, perhaps inflating their achievements and capabilities in job interviews or in reports, do better in life. Perhaps, paradoxically, self-deception can enhance people's motivation, mood, and even productivity. Warning. That being said, cognitive illusions can also lead to unwise decisions and errors due to unrealistic assessment of risks or plain wishful thinking, or from self-deception. Check out the nearby sidebar, Everyone's a Bit Better Than Average. The errors may lead to conflict due to resentments created by prejudice, scapegoating, and so on. Other unconscious biases may lead to the phenomenon known as attitude polarization, which is when two sides, with perhaps only minor differences, end up much further apart, because each side interprets information in distorted ways that reinforces their prejudices. Warning. Cognitive illusions are kinds of Trojan horses that unscrupulous salespeople or politicians can use to manipulate you. For example, politicians trying to worry people about an issue, say unemployment or immigration, may use scary music and images in a commercial, because the sensation of fear generates biases that favor their position. Trumping logic with belief. One of the most pervasive illusions from which everyone suffers is belief bias. This is the tendency to accept the logic of an argument not so much by a dispassionate, critical thinker-style analysis of its structure, but simply by an instinctive, knee-jerk assessment of the plausibility or otherwise of the conclusions. In one study, by Jonathan Evans, Julie Barston, and Paul Pollard, people were asked to evaluate arguments expressed in formal style, as syllogisms. A syllogism is an argument that consists of two premises, or starting assumptions, followed by a conclusion that is supposed to follow logically on from it. The researchers were really investigating the extent to which people simply accept arguments they encounter that support existing beliefs without any real examination. This idea, also explored in Chapter 2, connects to the one about the human brain being hardwired after eons of hunting wildebeest with sticks to take shortcuts rather than hang about to be gobbled by lions. Everyone's a bit better than average. According to Thomas Gilovich, a professor of psychology at Cornell University, a survey of 1 million high school seniors found that 70% thought they were above average in leadership ability, and only 2% thought they were below average. Nor did people grow out of their unrealistic self-assessments. A similar exercise involving university professors found that 94% thought they were better at their jobs than their run-of-the-mill colleagues. Other studies reveal that most people consider themselves to be happier, more fair-minded, more skillful behind the wheel, and so on, than the average person. Plus, of course, most people think that they're much less likely to fall into such silly errors than other people. Here are some example syllogisms of my own to try. Ask yourself which of these arguments is logical and valid. All dogs have fur. Boa is a python. Therefore, Boa doesn't have fur. Valid or invalid? Some cats like milk. Toby is a cat. Therefore, Toby likes milk. Valid or invalid? Red berries are dangerous to humans to eat. Raspberries are a kind of red berry. Therefore, raspberries are dangerous. Valid or invalid? I don't make you wait for the answers. Neither of the first two arguments is valid. Although pythons don't have fur, the first argument hasn't proved that. It doesn't even look like it will. So I hope you weren't taken in. In the second argument, you may have been tempted to give the argument some rope, because Toby probably does like milk if he's a cat. Nonetheless, if all you know is that some cats like milk, again, the conclusion isn't proved. The third argument is sort of valid. I say sort of because the wording contains a bit of fudge. The first premise, red berries are dangerous to humans to eat, is true in one sense and not true in another. Far too many arguments depend on such ambiguities. The problem even has its own name, the equivocation fallacy. With this one, if you take the claim as being that all red berries are dangerous, the argument is valid, even though the conclusion isn't true. Confused? That's because in logic, a valid argument means that if the starting assumptions are true, then the conclusion must be too. So yes, if all red berries were really dangerous, the argument is fine. In real life, though, the first premise isn't true. In real life, only some red berries are dangerous, and raspberries aren't one of them. If you read the argument to mean some red berries are dangerous, then the premise is true, but the argument becomes invalid. The common sense intuition to take the starting statement as saying only that lots of red berries are dangerous to humans to eat makes the argument invalid, because you can't draw any conclusions in this case about any particular kind of red berry.